All right. Well, welcome to Soteriology 101. We are having a live discussion. I've got a couple of guys already joined in. We put out an invite to several of others there on the Facebook group who could join in as we're going through this. And appreciate Clayton and John jumping on with us. We're going to be responding to an article by James Anderson from the Journal of the Reformed Theological Society. I think it's the name of it, something of that nature. We're going to read him in his own words, and then we're going to just kind of pause and respond to some of the things that he's saying. He's critiquing John Lennox's book, To Believe. It's a book that I have highly recommended because I think he does a really good job. He's one of the few really well-known apologetic scholars that holds to a perspective that's very similar to mine with regard to his rejection of the concept of total inability, his maintaining of eternal security are both distinctives that I hold to as a traditionalist or a provisionist that John Lennox defends as well in this book. And so I appreciate his work. There's a few things I would have probably taken a different approach on, which we may even get into in this review. But for the most part, I think he does a really fair job in his evaluation of Calvinism, which he refers to as Theistic Determinism. And we'll go through some of that as we go through this review. I just kind of asked Clayton and John, did you both have a chance, just out of curiosity, not that I expected you to, because this is kind of a last minute thing that I just jumped on to invite you guys to come on and be a part of it. Did you have a chance to read through the article yet?
Yeah, I did read it through.
Okay, great. John, did you have a chance?
I kind of skimmed over it.
Gotcha. Yeah, no worries. Yeah. That's why we're going to read it and then respond, because I don't expect it, especially this has been a last minute thing, that everybody read through it already. But and those who are tuning in, we already have 45 jumping on watching. Feel free to make comments in the side section there, and I will try to respond to questions that you may have or comments that you may have. It's better if you do tag me there at Soteriology 101 because it comes up as a yellow beacon for me to see, and I'll be more likely to see it if you do that there in the comment section there on the YouTube page. So let's do this. I'm getting used to Zoom here and trying to learn how to use it properly, and hopefully this works. This is the first section of the article here. I'm going to push this over here too, because it's distraction to see the video on the Facebook page. So he gives an introduction of the overall book itself and tells about John Lennox. He seems pretty fair. He's kind in his introduction to John. And just for the sake of time, I'm going to jump right in to part one, the problem defined, so that we can get to the meat really of the discussion, because I think that's the main portion of it there is how that plays itself out. So here's what Anderson writes. He says in chapter 1, the natural limitation of human freedom introduces the general topic of the book. Lennox notes that philosophers have distinguished between liberty of spontaneity, defined simply as the freedom to do whatever one wants to do, i.e. freedom from coercion, and liberty of indifference, understood as the freedom to do otherwise, given the exact same circumstances. Now, this is one of the issues that I might have taken with Lennox's approach, is I would never refer to our view of libertarian free will as liberty of indifference. For me, and he does make this caveat here. He says the freedom to do otherwise given the exact same circumstances, freedom to do not X, even though one in fact did X. The second view is identified as libertarian freedom. I note in passing that contra Lennox, not all contemporary defenders of libertarianism think it should be understood as liberty of indifference, which I guess that would include me, because I don't like that terminology. Just like within Calvinism, there are different views or different semantics in the way they argue their different perspectives. That's going to happen in any group. I don't like the concept of indifference or the idea of indifference, simply because it's not really, I think, capturing the objection that we're bringing to divine determinism. And so what I would say is what we would call freedom or free will would be the choice that we make is not determined by factors beyond our control. In other words, if our choices are determined by factors that are beyond our control, then by necessity, you have to understand that as a determined choice, and rather than a self-determined choice. In other words, a choice that's determined by oneself. I am in control of the factors that ultimately decide my decisions, and ultimately determine my determinations. And so, as we've said before, we believe in self-causation or self-determination, which is that the cause of an act is the actor. The cause of a choice is the chooser. The cause of a determination is the determiner. And there's more than one determiner in the world. God is not the only determiner from our perspective, but that he has actually created beings that have the ability to make self-caused choices, that have moral capacity, that are similar, not exactly like his or greater than him, obviously, but that are similar to him in that we have the capacity to make our own choices. Do you guys have anything you want to add to that? I don't know that that needs to be really unpacked anymore, except just to say we believe that our choices aren't determined by our creator.
Yeah, I didn't love that language either. Indifference is not great PR, for a position. I do think it kind of goes to the strength of what Lennox does, though, because he's a professor of mathematics, and so he's coming at all of these things almost as an outsider. And for the rest of the article, there are all of these things, kind of similar terminology that Anderson doesn't like. But what he's really doing is he's just trying to take things to their logical conclusion. And so I don't love the term. I guess what he's trying to say is it's indifferent to any outside stimulus, whether or not we make our decisions. There's nothing causal that's determining what we're doing. And so, it's at least fair. He's using terms
Right.
that we wouldn't really ascribe to. And the rest of it, they're kind of kicking and screaming through the rest of his book because they don't like the way that he's coming to the logical ends of things. And he's not necessarily just borrowing theological language. He's really just kind of going, what sums this up at its logical conclusion or the logical outcome of it. And so I definitely would choose a different term myself. But I agree with the sentiment, and I like the way that he's getting to his conclusions.
Yeah, I think that's fair. I think the other issue that I would just pull out is that a lot of people try to think of free will or the libertarian free will as we've defined it as being that there is there's no lack of freedom at all, like we're completely free in every regard.
Right.
And that's obviously not what our view is attempting to argue or say in any way.
We're not free to do the impossible,
Right.
Yeah.
And that's, I think, a really important distinction, just simply because when we're talking about free will from our perspective, at least, what we're trying to say is not that we're completely indifferent to all influential factors, but that we are not caused by influential factors, because then they stop being influential and they become determinative.
Right.
The fact that you call something an influential factor. So, for example, the example I've used in other videos is I might say, I ate that piece of cake because it tastes so good. That doesn't mean that the cause of my eating was the taste of the cake. The taste of the cake has no power over me individually. It's that I, as a responsible creature with moral accountability, chose to act upon that desire.
Yeah.
The Calvinist would often think, well, you're acting according to your greatest desire, as if that greatest desire is determined by somebody other than yourself. And it just becomes a circular argument. Well, he acted on it because it was his greatest desire. How do you know it was his greatest desire? Because he acted on it. Well,
Right.
And why did he act on it? Because it's his greatest desire. It's just a circular argument.
Yeah.
No, okay, he determined to act upon his desire to eat cake. He determined to act upon the fact that he loves the taste of it so much that it's his own choice. And so we're not trying to say that we're completely indifferent to or uninfluenced by factors outside of us. We're saying that we're ultimately the ones responsible for which of the desires we choose to act upon.
Yeah.
And one of I think the shortcomings of the Calvinistic perspective is it ultimately reduces our moral choices to animal instinctive type choices. Right. Because you're acting according to your greatest preset desire. Well, that's instinct. Just like the lion chooses to eat meat instead of grass, the lion's carnivorous. He's just choosing according to his greatest nature, which, by the way, is an analogy that Jeff Durbin and other Calvinists have used to try to explain compatibilism. So it's not just my analogy. It's the Calvinist analogy, and it's the reason I don't think it's sufficient to establish for human free will or culpability, because we don't hold a lion accountable for eating meat. We don't hold carnivorous beings responsible for choosing to eat meat. Why? Because that's who they are.
Yeah.
That's what they were made to do. And in the same way, the reason we hold people responsible for their choices is because intuitively we understand they're able not to do that thing. And they could have chosen to act upon a different desire. And
it always feels retroactive to me, because it's like they're going to act towards their greatest desire. And then you point out how we act against our desires all of the time. If we all just followed our greatest desires, we would be animals, our world would be chaos. But then you can say retroactively, well, that new choice was their greatest desire. And so it's almost cheating, because you can look backwards on actions and say, well, whatever they did was their greatest desire in that moment. And if it changed, then there was a new greatest desire. Instead of proactively saying, no, on the front side of that, they had actual choice to make between desires. Right. And of course, there's stimulus, and of course, there's influence, and there's the nature around us and our fallen world. But there was nothing causally determining that we would go after one desire or the other.
And if God has sovereignly decreed, unchangeably, scripted, whatever word you want to use, which desire you'll act upon, then in what significant way is that different than a carnivorous lion choosing to eat meat? Because ultimately you're choosing according to a desire that was pre-programmed, if you will. That's not words they would use. They would use sovereignly decreed. But you have to show us how sovereign decree is in any significant way different than pre-programming an avatar.
Right.
And if you an avatar is not a sentient being that has feelings. Okay, well, pretend that there is an avatar with the same qualities that we have as far as being a sentient being that has feelings and all those things, and you still have the same problem. You still have ultimately the programmer, God, decreeing, i.e. programming our desires and circumstances so that we could not have any control over the choices that we make, especially with regard to choosing to accept or reject the gospel, because Calvinists are not in any way unclear about what they believe with regard to man's moral incapacity to choose to receive God's offers of grace and reconciliation from the fall because of our fallen inabilities. John, did you want to jump in there? I heard you start.
Yeah, I don't. Just to go back to the intro of the book, I don't really have an issue with whatever terminology they want to use. He kind of unpacked what we all pretty much mean by free will, just the ability to do otherwise. And I just kind of want to echo what you said too. It doesn't mean we can do anything, any possible thing, or impossible things. But I think a lot of times when the Calvinist says that, it's vague when they say we act according to our desire, or, like a lion or something. I think Calvinism goes deeper than that, like the kind of compatibilist determinism. It isn't just we have this general desire, like, lions want to eat meat. But Calvinism goes even further than that. It necessitates which meat that lion will eat, or which choice. We have desires all day long. But the thing about Calvinist determinism is that some prior condition, be a secondary cause or God himself, necessitates the choice we will make. Completely apart from this vague notion of desire. We all have desire, but it's like it just necessitates the choice we make in real time. And to me, that's troublesome. So
yeah, I agree. And you're right. It's not just the desire to eat meat or not eat meat, but if sovereign decree of meticulous details, Dust Motes, as Sproul and Piper and others put it, it's not just his determining of which that I'll eat cake. He's determined which color, shape, flavor of cake that I'd be eating, ultimately within his sovereign decree. But this gets into some of the critique, because Lennox is critiqued by Anderson on his views of causal determinism and what that entails, and other possible views of secondary causes that he throws in here, which we'll get into in the review. So let's pull it back up and continue on here. Just have to push the share button here. All right. So he goes on to saying, having distinguished these two kinds of freedom, Lennox declares in this book, when I use the term free will, I shall understand it in this second sense. In other words, whenever Lennox speaks of free will, he means libertarian free will. This is a remarkable admission at the outset of the book that purports to educate between the differences between the views of free will. If one is asking the question, what is the biblical view of free will? It simply won't do to define free will in libertarian terms, for that implies either that theistic determinists don't believe in free will or that they're inconsistent if they do. Such would be blatantly question-begging and prejudicial. Surely most theistic determinists do affirm that we have free will, at least with respect to many of our choices, but they think that free will should be understood along compatibilist rather than determinant libertarian lines. Okay, so this is where he gets into the whole, we believe in free will too. We just don't define free will in the same way you define free will. And therefore, Lennox, you're wrong because you're assuming your definition of free will is the correct definition of free will, i.e. question begging. And so he kind of starts off by this whole kind of bringing this accusation, if you will, against Lennox as saying you can't just assume free will is in the libertarian, should be understood in the libertarian sense. Now, I don't think he's just assuming that it should. I think he's made his argument already that it should. And therefore, he's setting out to say, when I talk about it, this is the way I'm discussing free will, which, by the way, is the most common basic understanding of free will. Is really, it's redundant even to say libertarian free will. It's almost unneeded. You could just say the word will. you could just say, do humans have a will? Do humans have a will of their own? Or is there any significant way in which you could talk about God's will and human will in any significant way different or autonomous of each other? Or is God's will always the decisive cause of what man will? Because on theistic determinism, i.e. compatibilistic Calvinism, God's will, i.e. his desire, his decree in eternity past, is ultimately, intricately, and meticulously tied to the human will. So there's never a sense in what the human will choose to do that is any way distinguishable from what God has willed for the human to will. Now, oftentimes this is where you get into the whole issue of two wills of God. Well, that's the external will of God is you shall not kill, or you shall not lie. But then there's the eternal or internal or the secret divine sovereign will, and that is he's decreed for you to lie. And that, of course, we would have issues with that because we don't believe God decrees, causes, in any way in his holy nature determines for the sin of creatures. The Bible clearly says in 1 John 2:16 that pride and lust, the things of evil, do not come from the Father, but from the world. And so to say that this comes from a decree of God, his eternal decree, is ultimately the reason that we choose to lie, is the ultimate factor that's beyond our control. That is the debate here as to whether or not God is the one who decrees for us to lie, and that's ultimately the reason we lie, i.e. he decrees our strongest desire at any given moment in the circumstances that he's decreed, or has he decreed for us to have a free will? Has he decreed for us to be able to make our own determinations? That's the debate here, in my opinion.
It's a really, this was a really strange part of the article for me because it's like he's frustrated that Lennox clearly stated his view up front. I just don't understand, like, all he did was say, hey, let me define the terms I'm using in my book so that there's not confusion as we move forward, and I use this term, and you don't have to question what it actually means. And it feels like Anderson really made a mountain out of a molehill by Lennox just saying, here is how I'm using this. I'm not making the case that free will always means this in every setting, but in this book that I'm the author of, this is what it means. And it is interesting to me because I think one of the things that can be very confusing about Calvinism is a lack of clarity in their terms, and how terms become very malleable, and how from a kind of a softer Calvinist to a more deterministic Calvinist, the same terms, even the same 5 points of Calvinism can take on very different nuances and different meanings. And it's gonna be very confusing to have these conversations. And Lennox is just kind of clearing out all of the clutter to just really simply say, in this book that I'm in charge of, I'm writing it. When I say free will, this is what it means. And yeah, that was a really strange start to the article for me. It felt like he took that really the wrong way.
Yeah, I agree with everything you said. And that's what most people mean by it. I think, honestly, I think Calvinists or compatibilists should get they should use another term for what they believe about the will. Free will is just, I feel like it's been hijacked, to be honest.
Well, and to be fair, I mean, there is an article, for example, I'm pulling it up here, where John Piper, it's called a primer on the doctrine of free will by Piper. Can y'all see that okay?
Yes, sir.
It says Piper also wrote, God is the only being who is ultimately self-determining. Like we talked about before, we would say he has created us and we're self-determining. In other words, we make our own determinations. That doesn't mean we determine everything, but we do determine those things which are morally accountable choices. And so he says God is the only being who is self-determining, and is himself ultimately the disposer of all things, including all choices. So Piper is John Piper, but by the way, Anderson later references John Piper as someone he agrees with. So I'm assuming that Anderson would agree with other things that John Piper has written. I don't know. I can't put those words in his mouth, but here is one of the most, I think, notable Calvinistic sources in the United States today, who this author actually quotes in his own articles. So I think it's probably worth looking at what Piper says and to give a clear representation of Calvinism. And so God is the only self-determining creature or creator. He's the only being who's self-determining, I should say. And he himself ultimately the disposer of all things, including all choices. That means he determines all choices. So my choice to cheat on my taxes was determined by one ultimately self-determining creature. Hitler's choice to kill billions was determined by God. I mean, that you can't get around that. That's just, I'm not trying to misrepresent them. I'm not trying to be mean to them. I'm just taking what they said. God disposes all choices. God determines all choices. That means God determined and disposed of the choice of Jeffrey Dahmer to rape and eat a child. I don't know how you get, is that not being fair? Is that being overly emotive? I mean, it was Piper's.
No, I just wanted to interject here real quick. Just going back what Clayton said, this is where a lot of their language just it's ambiguous. And see, like what you just quoted there, how is God's disposing of all of our choices? How is that not causal? You know, they want to say, well, God does all these things, but none of them are causal. Like God is not the cause. But I'm like, how can any event happen apart from being caused to happen? So I think if you're going to commit to,
and if the decree is not causal, if the decree is not causal, then what is the significance of a decree? In other words, what is it then?
Yeah, and, okay. And how does it make things happen?
Right. How does, if it's not causing something to happen, then how is it? Why even say it? In other words, just take it out of your vocabulary. You don't need to say it. If God's not causing all things to happen, then why are you saying God decrees all things to happen? Because it carries no weight. Then you just removed any force from that language. You just moved any meaning from the word, it seems. Right. Well, and here's another quote that is very popular there from Talbert on the Desiring God website. In other words, it's still on the website. It's not something he edited this book, Piper did. So God brings about all things in accordance with his will. In other words, it isn't just that God manages to turn evil aspects for our will to good. So that's what some people might say is what God's doing. He's taking and he's turning something bad to good. So he's allowing for evil people to do things and he's turning it for good. That's what we would say possibly, right? Or even some lower forms of Calvinists might even say that. But notice he's even saying that's not what God's doing. He's not turning evil aspects for good to those who love him. It's rather that he himself brings about these evil aspects for his glory. In other words, this word bring about, is that what you mean by decree? That he brings about, and is bring about is that not causal language? If I bring something about, am I not saying that I'm causing in at least some way that to happen? It seems to mean that,
Yeah.
and so it says, this includes, as incredible and unacceptable as it may currently seem, God's even brought about the Nazis' brutality at Birkenwald and Auschwitz, as well as the terrible killings of Dennis Rader and even the sexual abuse of a young child. So I'm not trying to be emotive here. This is on his website. So the molestation of a child was brought about by God on Calvinism, on theistic determinism.
And look how he contrasts, quote unquote, brings about with turning the evil aspects of the world. So when you think of God manages to turn the evil, that's almost like what we would say. He allows
Right.
it and then he turns it. So what Piper is doing here is he's contrasting bringing about with allowing. They're not the same thing. So how is bringing about not causal?
Right. Well, and also the Westminster Confession does much of the same thing. It even says God doesn't foresee something and then permit it. That's not what that they actually anticipate that some will interpret their words that way, and they disqualify that as a possibility, and even say that God has, obviously decreed whatsoever comes to pass from their perspective. And so back to that first quote from Piper. He's the disposer of all things, including all choices, however many or diverse or intervening causes are. On this definition, no human being has free will at any time. And so he's acknowledging, I think, what Anderson is that if you define free will in this way, that he's defined it here, that we don't have free will in the most basic sense of the word free will, self-determining will, okay? Neither before or after the fall. Now, notice that. Neither before or after the fall. So not even Adam and Eve had this freedom on Piper's view. Okay? In heaven or creatures ultimately self-determining. There are great measures of self-determination, as the Bible often shows, but never is man the ultimate or decisive cause. So notice here, what is decisive cause? It's the cause that decides. I mean, that's what it means. It's the decisive cause. So man is not the decisive cause of his preferences and choices. So let that sink in. So if I prefer to rape, kill, and destroy, and I choose to rape, kill, and destroy, I am not the decisive cause of that. That is not from me. That is from the Father, according to John Piper. Again, I'm taking him for his words. I'm putting them in front of you so that you see it for yourself. I'm not trying to misrepresent him. I'm taking him what he's saying. Man is not the decisive cause of his preferences and choices. When man's agency and God's agency are compared, both are real. Now, I don't know how he justifies both of them being real. I think that's where they appeal to mystery. They would say, I don't know how men's choices are real in a deterministic world, but they both are, and we just ad hoc say they are, but God's is decisive. So in other words, he is the decisive cause of men's preferences and choices for both good and evil. Yet here's the mystery that caused so many to stumble. God is always decisive in such a way that man's agency is real. So this is just like an ad hoc claim out of nowhere without any substance whatsoever, as far as I can tell, that yeah, it's true. God's the decisive cause of your choices and actions, your preferences, but your agency is still real. And if we question that, then you just don't understand Calvinism. You just don't get it. You're just not smart enough, or you're just not humble enough to accept the clear meaning of the text. And his responsibility remains.
Just man-centered.
Yeah, or you're man-centered, right. So man's still responsible on Calvinism. They're not trying to say men aren't held culpable. Obviously, they're punished for their choices. But they still maintain that those choices are decisively caused, that's his words, not mine, decisively caused by the divine decree, by God, by the Father. God is decisive. He's the only decisive. He's the only self-determining creature. So keep that in mind as we read through this, because you're going to hear a lot of accusations of misrepresentation. You're going to hear a lot of times of him say he just doesn't understand Calvinism. And I've just read from one of the leading Calvinistic sources that Anderson himself references as an authority. So you have to be the judge of who's being fair here in the representation of others and letting them speak for themselves. So keep that in mind as well. Anything else to add before I pull this next
Well, I just think, I mean, you've done such a good job of, reinforcing how can we be held responsible if we're not actually able to respond. And, I think this causally determined worldview, I also think it has real implications for even the nature of God as we understand it. If everything we do has been determined, then as humans, we have no potential. And God is omnipotent. He is all power. And God actually, who is it? Geisler says that God doesn't have potential, right? If he had potential, he could change. And we are potential. And it's like, how do you know a line is crooked if you've never seen a straight one? Well, God is omnipotent and we are just potential. But on true Calvinism, consistent Calvinism, we have no potential. And so in a certain sense, I get the accusations about being man-centered, but what could be more man-centered than God determining every single thing, even our thoughts, preferences, and choices? And so, yeah, I think it really destroys the character of God and really does away with any sense of real justice.
Yeah, and before we go back to the article, I wanted to point this out too. This is from monergism.com, which is a respected Calvinistic site that's often referenced. And the title of this article is "How Can God Be Sovereign and Man Still Be Free?" And it's defining compatibilism for us. And he gives us a definition of compatibilism. And so I'm just pointing this out in order for us to understand. And in order to understand, this is from the article, from a Reformed Calvinistic scholar. In order for us to understand this better, theologians have come up with the term compatibilism to describe the concurrence of God's sovereignty and man's responsibility. Compatibilism is a form of determinism. Now, I'm just going to point this out because the author of this article, Anderson, he seems to acknowledge this as well. In other words, he's not trying to deny determinism, and neither are the leading scholars. I can't tell you how many thousands of times I get people on my Facebook page, on Twitter, or other places, what I might refer to as nominal Calvinists, people who are Calvinists by name but don't know anything about the scholarship of Calvinism. And they'll try to say, we're not determinists. We don't believe in determinism. If you are a compatibilist, you are a determinist, okay? Compatibilism is stating that man's responsibility is compatible with determinism. In other words, God is the decisive cause of men's preferences and choices, yet men are still held culpable for those preferences and choices nonetheless. Okay, that is compatibilism. And it's not less deterministic than hard determinism. That's what he says. Compatibilism is a form of determinism, and it should be noted that this position is no less deterministic than hard determinism. In other words, every dust mote, every thought, action, deed is ultimately determined by God and his desires. His will is what we will. Okay, so forget libertarian free, just use the word will. Okay, you don't have to have all that baggage there. Do men have a will that's in any way autonomous or separate from what God wills in the matter? And on determinism, no. God wills what we will ultimately will in every circumstance. That is what we are objecting against. That's what John Lennox was objecting against. And you have to determine whether people who are critiquing John Lennox, like Anderson and others, are actually confronting that point, because it doesn't seem like to me that they are. It simply means, according to the article, that God's predetermination and meticulous providence is compatible with voluntary choice. Our choices are not coerced, i.e., we do not choose against what we want or desire. In other words, the lion is not being coerced to eat meat instead of grass. The lion chooses freely to eat meat because that is his greatest desire, but that's instinctive. In other words, he's not doing it as a moral choice, and it's not considered a moral choice. Why? Because it is instinctive, and that's exactly the same reason that I would reject his view of compatibilism, that you're ultimately free and responsible if you're doing what you want. The lion's ultimately free and responsible if he's doing what he wants. I just don't find that as a significant basis on which to rest human responsibility and culpability. In light of scripture, according to compatibilism in this article, human choices are exercised voluntarily. In other words, they're doing what they want. But the desires and circumstances, listen to this, the desires and circumstances that bring about these choices occur through divine determinism. Okay? So they're saying you're free as long as you're doing what you desire. But remember, your desires and those circumstances in which those desires are engaging are brought about by determinism. Okay. So God's determining your desires and the circumstances so that you will do what you do. And then he uses the example of the crucifixion, Joseph's brothers, the same ones that are typically done, all of which can easily be explained through God knowing a person and his character in those given circumstances, like a police sting operation or something like that we've talked about before. There's no reason to assume divine determinism of moral evil choices in order to bring about the selling of Joseph's brothers or the crucifixion, for example. Was somebody jumping in there? Go ahead.
Yeah, I was going to say, this is when they talk about responsibility here under that framework. That's a responsibility that none of us in the real world like recognize. It's unrecognizable. You know, this to me, this is like it's very theoretical. It's almost like some of these odd things that, you know, college campuses teach about gender. It's just all on paper, but when you got out into the real world, none of this applies. Like, how often do we treat our children like this? When we hold our children responsible, we base it upon their ability. We don't come in with this esoteric idea of compatibilist responsibility that they had no choice, no decision-making power, and we don't take their ability into consideration. So this is it's just foreign and unrecognizable. And the other thing is, I think I really like what William Lane Craig says. When you boil down compatibilism, determinism, what have you, it really comes down to there's only one actor, and it's God. You know, when he says there's the other agents, our wills are real. No, they're not. They're not. It's just God. It's real. It's like a kid in a box of toys. Honestly.
Right.
So
but it comes down to just pure contradiction where you say A and not A are true. Men are responsible, but they're not really able to respond. Okay, A and not A. I mean, that's all that Piper's quote just now said. Yeah, God's decisive cause of that, but men's agency is real. Okay, so men have no control over their agency, but God treats them like they are in control of their agency. So we're just to accept this because John Piper says it, because Calvinists declare it, and because they'll, you know, rake us over the clothes as not being biblical or humble enough, or whatever reason that you've got to give us a biblically sound reason for believing that A equals not A. and if you were to do that, then you would ultimately be nullifying the Bible, because you would be ultimately saying the Bible is contradictory with itself, which nullifies it. And I'm sorry, I just don't think the Bible has to be thought of as being self-contradictory. Notice last thing I wanted to point out in here that's contradictory with what Anderson just said. Again, this is a Calvinistic source. We should be clear, neither compatibilists nor hard determinists affirm that in any man has free will. Okay, so he understands free will in the way that we do, which is why he says we don't have free will. We have voluntary choice, but we don't have free will. Those who believe man has free will are not compatibilists, but should rather be called inconsistent, according to this Reformed scholar. So again, like any group, they're going to have divergence of opinions. But the reason he's making this point is to try to show that people who try to maintain free will as normally and understood throughout human history aren't consistent compatibilists. And that would, I think, include even the author of this particular blog. So it's not just us calling him inconsistent; it's his own calling him inconsistent. In that.
Another thing I wanted to say is I've quoted that monergism article plenty of times. The Calvinists, most of the ones that I talk with, they shudder at hard determinism, and they stand behind compatibilism. But if even as monergism says it's no less deterministic, then what is a distinction? Like if it's if on hard determinism we are puppets, but on compatibilism we're not, yet it's no less deterministic. If it walks like a duck, quacks like a duck, then it's a duck. And I don't understand what is the distinct, what left is there, what's the difference between the two? Right. And I've never really heard a solid answer to that. So
well, and how does it avoid the objection? That's where it really comes down to, because you bring an objection to what they deem as puppetry and hard determinism, and then they don't give you a distinction with the difference between what they view and what the hard determinists would view. In other words, you give us no distinction between the avatar who's programmed by the programmer and what you believe God is doing through sovereign decree. You give us no true, real distinction with the difference between those two. Then you haven't avoided the objection that you're trying to avoid by putting in all those caveats, So why even bother putting in all those caveats if they don't get you anywhere? Which is exactly why some people like Theodore and Sonny there in Houston were fine with just adopting hard determinism, because they see exactly what we see, and that is there is no difference with the distinction between them, so we might as well own it and just defend it by shouting people down and telling them they don't believe the Bible, because you ultimately have no place to go unless you draw a clear distinction with the difference between your worldview and the hard determinism of, puppetry or robotics or any of those kinds of things. Continuing with the article. So he goes, okay, the following analogy should illustrate what a questionable move this is on Lennox's part. Critics of Christianity, such as Dawkins, Harris, typically define faith as belief in the absence of evidence, and on that basis charge the Christian faith is a danger to reason and science. Lennox would rightly protest at this highly prejudicial definition. He might well counter that faith in the Christian sense would be defined as trust based on evidence. But suppose his opponent were to reply, sure, I realize that people have defined faith in different ways, but my critique of Christianity, I'm going to stick with defining faith as belief in the absence of evidence. What do y'all think of that comparison to what he thinks Lennox is doing?
I mean, I think it's fair if he wants to, if they want to define free will as they do, and we do. I mean, I think in any kind of discussion, you have to respect the way the opposition has defined their terms. So I don't have a problem with that. I just don't think it's, in the end, it just boils down to it's just so ambiguous when you start analyzing the way they have defined it. And does it measure up? Does it really give us human responsibility and culpability? And so, yeah, you can define it any way you want. I'll adopt your terms, but when we start to analyze it, you can't, retreat or dodge. You got to, be honest about
Right.
what it is. So,
and that would be true in a discussion, like if you're trying to have a discussion with somebody and say, okay, I'll adopt your views for the sake of this discussion. But as I think Clayton, you pointed out earlier, this is his book. So
yeah, I mean, that's what I'm thinking is, if Sam Harris, and if he wants to write a book and he says in the beginning, when I say faith, I mean belief without evidence. And when I say that in this book, that's what I mean. He's at least defined his terms. And then when you want to write something counter, you want to write a book or a blog or a video, put out a video in response, then you can correct it. And so if Dr. Anderson just wants to come in and go, hey, this is how he defined it and here's why he's wrong, I think that's fine. What's strange to me is him arguing with how Lennox decided to clarify terms in his book. Like, it's just his book, and Sam Harris can write his book, and Anderson can write his book. And what I think is crucial is that there is clarity in terms, because if we don't know what words mean, then how do we know how to counter it or argue against it?
Right, and plus that is the debate. Oftentimes, is what is the proper definition of this? In other words, what is God's view of human responsibility and freedom?
Right.
If God's view of human responsibility and freedom is people are doing what I have determined for them to desire to do, then hey, be a Calvinist and a compatibilist. But that's the debate. We don't believe that's what God has defined as being morally accountable and free, and thus responsible for your choices. We don't believe that that's established biblically. So that's why John Lennox has every right to define the terms from his theological perspective and give reasons for doing so, as anyone else would have. So all good points. Let's go back to the article.
The only thing I would say in defense of Anderson is that technically John Lennox's book is a critique of determinism, like theistic determinism. So if you're going to go into their world and critique their view, you kind of have to adopt their terminology and their language and their constructs. So I think, but at the same time, you just quoted John Piper, who's he's not a marginal Calvinist. He's a major player, and he doesn't define it that way either. But I think just to be fair, I think there's kind of a line there, but I mean.
Well, like you said, you got to define it by, well, whose standard, which determinist defines it? The monergism.com, Anderson, Piper, who defines theistic determinism? And again, like you said before, is there a distinction with a difference that really makes the objection any less harsh? if I were to use the perfect semantics that pleases my my audience in a perfect way, which would be impossible because your audience is not monolithic. But if it was possible for me to use semantics that perfectly pleased every Calvinist, and I were to define theistic determinism, i.e. compatibilism, their view, perfectly to the satisfaction of every single one of them, and then bring the objection, in what significant way does changing any of the semantics deter from that objection?
Yeah, I think Anderson,
it doesn't.
I think Anderson honestly should be a little bit grateful, because I don't think he could have written as just deep of a review and argument if there wasn't as much clarity. And I think if Lennox was writing on something that there are just very few iterations of within Christianity, a term that's widely agreed upon, that's fine, but he's not. And when it comes to anthropology and specifically the human will, it's, does God have one will or does God have two wills? And did he decree everything before the foundation of the world, or was there a decree after the fall? And what was it, deterministic before the fall and human depravity? Or, there's it's so nuanced across this gigantic spectrum that I really don't know what you could do other than just go, I know there's a lot of people say about this. Here's what I say, and here's how I'm defining it moving forward. A book is difficult because it's not a conversation. It's, hundreds of pages at a time. And so I do get it. And I try to do that even on the discussion board. Like, I will try to use terms that I know a certain Calvinist uses and has adopted into their language in conversation. But it's a little more difficult in putting out something that's as extensive as chapter after chapter of a book.
Yeah, I agree. Let's pick up chapter 2 here from his review. He says, different kinds of determinism begins well with the distinguishing the physical determinism of atheists such as Hawkins and Harris from the theistic determinism held by some Christians. Unfortunately, matters go downhill from this point, as a discussion of theistic determinism abounds with question-begging claims and straw men. Nothing new there. I don't think I've ever had a conversation with a Calvinist where there's not a straw man accusation of some sort, sometimes because you can be quoting directly from John Calvin, and you're not necessarily misrepresenting Calvinism, you're misrepresenting their form of Calvinism, or you're not saying it in a way that sounds real palatable or agreeable. It's different. In other words, you can say something that's technically true, but that's not palatable. For example, when I've read that quote, or I've stated that quote about God bringing about child abuse for his own glory, I've had Calvinists squawk at that, and rightly so. I mean, it's a very detestable thing to think of and to say. But then I take them to the quote and say, well, here's the scholar saying it, and then they would shift to starting to defend what the scholar was saying. Instead of just saying, oh, you're straw manning me, then I would show them, here's a quote from a scholar saying what I'm accusing you of believing. And then they shift to start defending it. Well, what he means by that is, well, what he's saying is, okay, that's fine. Don't accuse me of straw manning for saying the exact same words that your opponent, your own scholars are saying. You can say, well, what they meant by that was this, and then give us a distinction with a difference that actually removes the detestability of that statement itself, which is what I've yet to find a Calvinist willing or able to do, in my estimation. I've not yet heard a Calvinist able to explain those things in a way, at least, that aligns with Scripture and or appeases the major objection of the claim. He goes on to say, Lennox assumes without argument. I would question that. He does make several arguments for these things, in my opinion. Lennox assumes without argument that theistic determinism, the view that God ultimately determines everything that takes place in his creation, entails theistic causal determinism, the view that God causally determines everything. And we already touched on this, Cranman. You mentioned earlier, John, that, okay, so if God bringing about, i.e. decreeing all things, is not causal determinism, then what is it?
Yeah, what is it? Theistic non-causal determinism?
And what does that mean?
I don't know how.
And what
what does that even? God has a plan and he wants to execute it, but he doesn't actually execute it because his execution has no causal power. That makes no sense. So.
Or if it only has partly causal power, like it doesn't cause the rape, but it allows it and turns it. Oh wait, he already said we don't do that. So
Yeah.
can't
So
do that.
what else is left? Yeah.
I think
it's flat. You flattened it out, John. If you say it's more diamond multi-orb shape, then you would understand.
Right. Did you just gaslight me?
Just throw that. Some people don't like to say we appeal to mystery on this point because they make fun of other people who appeal to mystery. So they'll say things like, "Oh, you're flattening it out. It's multi-diamond orb shaped," and which is another way for them to say, "We don't know how to explain it. It's just true, and you better accept it." And so that's kind of what this guy's done here too. Okay, so and I read through this article. Did I miss anything? Maybe Clayton or John, either one that's seen this. Does he give a alternative to causal determinism?
Nothing that goes further than just application. I mean, it's like you saw, we just read in the Piper article, we still make voluntary choices, but we're not in charge of our preference. We're not in charge of our desires. We're not in charge of our choices. And so maybe an application, it makes you feel better about it, but the implications are still there, that at the end of the day, and this is why I think like this is primarily a conversation around the first point of Calvinism. But when Augustine laid these foundations, one was birthed out of the other, and they really don't stand without all five of them succinctly together. And so as soon as you move to the second point of unconditional election, it's like, who cares? You know, you have voluntary choice, you don't have voluntary choice. At the end of the day, it's already been decided where you end up in eternity. And this life is just a small blip on the radar in comparison to eternity. And so, you know, it's like the ends have been decided and we're arguing about the means. And it just seems like they keep landing in the most just contradictory ideas and trying to put forth doctrines that at the end of the day, if you press and press and press, you have to appeal to mystery to try and understand how we have no choice and we have choice. And
well, and while you were saying that too, I pulled up Piper's article again just to show it, because he says it's not causal. But remember, that's the word Piper used, decisive cause, which the word decisive means determinative. It is the cause that decides. And then over here, back to Anderson, he's saying it's not, see, it entails theistic causal determinism. And so, and he says, and so he's critiquing Piper, really. He's not critiquing, I mean, he is critiquing Lennox, but he's also critiquing his own scholars, because his own scholars refer to theistic causal determinism. I know Chris Date, I hate to put words in Chris Date's mouth, but I'm pretty sure Chris Date affirms theistic causal determinism of all things. So I don't know why he thinks that's a complete misrepresentation of compatibilism or the leading scholars of compatibilism. Maybe there's a subgroup out there of non-theistic causal determinists, but they're theistic determinists, but not theistic causal determinists. I don't know.
Right.
I don't know.
Non-causal determinism sounds a little bit like, if you're a compatibilist, what you have to believe about the garden pre-fall, that God had a plan and he was able to get to that plan without causally determining, or without the depraved desires determining the actions of humanity. And it doesn't seem like a far stretch away from what most people who believe in libertarian free will actually believe, that God does have a plan.
Like Molinist and others that explain some of those things, right?
Yeah, and so I really feel like if you pressed and pressed and pressed, like on monergism, if you pressed monergism.com, if you pressed them, non-causal determinism at the end of the day is causal. Right. That would be my guess.
Well, and then he goes on to say, Lennox does not even consider the possibility of a theistic non-causal determinism, let alone a hybrid view in which God determines all things by combination of causal and non-causal means. He seems to be kind of being a little bit unfair to Lennox there to say, okay, not only are you to defend against the Piper view of causal determinism, but you have to also include all these subgroups within your book and make it, another 100 or 200 pages in order to be fair. it's not his obligation to confront every form of theistic determinism. He did acknowledge, and he even shows that he acknowledges there are other forms of determinism. The fact that Lennox just chooses to confront the most popular rising one among neo-Calvinists today isn't Lennox's fault. I mean, he has the right to define and focus on the form of determinism he wants to confront, right?
Well, and at the end of the day, again, I think, Lennox is a mathematician, and he is taking, it seems like he's taking all these different views and seeing that the logical implication of all of them lands at a causal deterministic worldview, even if you try desperately not to get there. And I mean, we've seen examples of people who get pressed and pressed and pressed, and will have to say at the end of the day, yes, God did decree the Holocaust. He stayed his hand and allowed man to see their ultimate depravity. Yes, he did, decree the rape of a child. And so Lennox is like, man, I'm gonna go to the end point of where all of these things are headed if they're just honest within their own systematic. And that's all it feels like he's doing. And I know, it feels harsh to talk about, well, you just go to the Holocaust, you just go to rape or whatever. I think that really does show, though, I'm comfortable with the logical conclusion of free will libertarianism and the things that they throw at us in the same way. Well, does that mean people really can choose to believe what, if the gospel is presented to them? Yes, I do believe that. I'm okay with that logical implication. The logical implication of theirs is so palatable. It is such a distortion of the character of God that they have to kind of work their way around it, what it seems like.
Yeah, I would agree. He goes on and said, this is just one example of Lennox's failure to represent fairly the other side. And I would disagree. I think he's representing one aspect of theistic determinism, compatibilism, which, as you say, all logically entail within every form of compatibilism is logically entailed the same problems, unless they can convince us that somehow compatibilism isn't have the same ultimate result as hard determinism, and therefore carry the same objections.
Well, they got to fight each other first, because monergism.com says that it is.
Right, exactly.
Hey, guys, I'm gonna have to roll. But I just wanted to kind of just add one more thing to what you guys were just saying. It's like that's the section that really caught my attention there, because that's typically what I deal with when I talk with compatibilists. Just determinism, like what does it mean and what does it entail? And just reading through this, like when he speaks of non-causal determinism, okay, first it's almost like compatibilists, they've redefined free will to mean something really foreign to what most of us mean by it. And now it's almost like they've redefined determinism to be non-causal. The standard definition of determinism when it comes to human choice is that human choices are caused by prior conditions. So It's like when we take the causal component out of it, it just, I don't even know what you're talking about. That's not determinism. Like, how can you non-causally determine something? And how can you necessitate?
It's this kind of nuancing is the reason that Dr. Ken Wilson, the guy from Oxford that was on the show, he ends up calling it non-free free will or something, because he's trying to avoid using the word determinism, because everybody has different ways in which they've defined determinism and free will now, that he just comes up with his own phrase of saying non-free free will, just to try to appeal to, all the nuances of definitions that are out there. But yeah, John, thanks for jumping on, and feel free to bow out anytime. It's totally understandable.
All right, see you guys later. Bye.
God bless, brother.
Yeah.
He goes on to say, he says there are different ways of understanding the concept of sovereignty. One is in the terms of divine determinism. Another is that God is a loving creator who has made human beings in his image with a significant capacity to choose, with all its marvelous potential of love, truth, and moral responsibility. So that's what Lennox said. So in other words, he's contrasting divine determinism with a loving creator who has made human beings in his image with a significant capacity to choose. And so obviously what Lennox means by significant capacity to choose, with all of its potential is talking about a libertarian view of freedom as we would define it. Now, he defines it in a more palatable way than he defines and explains divine determinism, obviously, because he's making an argument. So saying something that's more palatable in one way versus the other isn't necessarily misrepresentative. You might say it's a form of a character or something of that nature, maybe. But I don't think there's anything wrong with one side painting their view, especially in contrast to the way the other side is painting theirs. Because when we talk about a significant capacity, well, the reason he says significant capacity is because some people say, oh yeah, no, we as Calvinists, we say people have the capacity to choose, they just don't want to. Well, that's why he says significant capacity here, because what they really mean is that you don't have the capacity to desire to choose otherwise. And because your nature is such that it's dead, fallen, in a fallen condition that it can't choose to do otherwise. It can't desire to choose to do otherwise. And so he throws in the word significant there in order to qualify capacity. It's the same reason we have to throw in the word libertarian and the word free before will in order to qualify what it means, because you've got so many people coming in here nitpicking a word so much so that you have to explain it so as to understand. We're talking about a significant, in other words, a meaningful capacity to choose. What does choose mean? To select between available options. Does a reprobate, a non-elect person that Jesus did not die for, have options, significant options? Does he have the capacity, the moral capacity to choose to follow Christ? No, Christ didn't even die for him. Christ didn't want him. He doesn't have the faith that has to be given by necessity through some effectual gift. So even if you took out all these other words, significant capacity, even if you just said to choose, that in itself implies the capacity to pick between available options, of which the reprobate doesn't have any. Not really.
Yeah,
go ahead.
It's a strange, I mean, it's obviously a quote from the book taken out of context. This isn't, it gives the illusion that Lennox just said one thing about divine determinism. Like that was it. This is his whole thesis on, no, he's just explained it significantly in the book. And now he says one example of Lennox's failure to represent fairly the other side. He gives this quote, and it's like, yeah, I mean, Lennox wrote an entire book against determinism. He's not here to prop it up. And his point isn't to try and get people who believe in divine determinism to understand it differently or give them a new PR package around it. He is setting out to write a book, which is a long, lengthy, very serious undertaking, in order to persuade people to consider another option. And so the whole thing is still just a little bit strange to me. Of if you disagree with this, then let's get into it, pick it apart, tell me why it's wrong. But you know, he's almost offended by the way that Lennox has presented his case, and he's being persuasive. That's why he set out to write a book. So I just
and not that two wrongs make a right. Not that Lennox is necessarily being wrong here in these wordings, but and I'm not trying to justify bad behavior by saying, well, they do it too. But it is true that the leading non-Calvinists or the leading Calvinists, like Piper and others, do not go the extra mile to strive to represent our view in a palatable way in the times that I've read them. Very rarely do I hear Arminianism and or provisionism or traditional Southern Baptist perspectives represented in a way that I appreciate or in a palatable way. Usually it's something like, oh, those people over there believe that God travels in a DeLorean into the future to see who's going to believe, and he chooses those people, as Chandler put it. Or God looks through the quarters of time as if he's stuck on the timeline trying to gather in information like some human, some powerful human being with, a magic ball, to look into the future to see what's going to happen. I mean, they caricature our view all the time in the mainstream formats. And so it seems to me that in comparison, Lennox does a lot better job of representing theistic determinism than do theistic determinists representing us. At least it seems to be objectively my opinion, at least, if not objective. Okay, so it goes on. Note the clear implication. Theistic determinists must deny that God has made human beings in his image with a significant capacity to choose. Of course, no Orthodox Calvinist would say such a thing. Well, of course they wouldn't. We're not trying to say that Calvinists they would never say that they don't believe people make a significant capacity to choose. We're arguing that the claims of your system don't allow for any significant capacity to choose. Because if what you say about God determining your desires is true, then that is not a significant capacity to choose on our view. That's our argument. So it's not our responsibility to always put things in the way you would want them to be put, because we disagree with the way you're putting them. We don't believe that somebody is a real agent with real responsibility if they're being causally determined by God in a decisive way, like Piper put it. We disagree with that. That's the whole reason we're writing this book. Lennox is writing this book. The whole reason we're going over this is to argue the point that you don't believe it's a significant capacity to choose if you understand those words as they are intended to be understood. And so,
yeah, it seems like he got it. I mean, he understands the implication of his book, and that is what the implication is. And the hard thing about Calvinism is the eventual appeal to mystery. And you're right, when Calvinists are writing against libertarian free will, they immediately go to the straw man of, so you can save yourself, or all evil in the world is without purpose. Yeah. And those things, what I tend to notice is with any level of research, those things don't bother people who are true believers in free will, because there are pretty simple answers to those issues, and they're right in the pages of Scripture. Ultimately, when pressed on how you can choose and have no choice, you have to appeal to mystery. On theodicy, ultimately, when God is causing evil but isn't the author of evil, you have to appeal to mystery. And that's kind of the Calvinist white flag of surrender. They wouldn't see it that way, but it's like when you press the argument to their appeal to mystery, they're tapping out. You've taken the system as far as it can go logically, because it's moved into illogical territory. And that's why I think it's probably why it's so lengthy of a blog in response, because it's difficult to just come at the points that Lennox is making head on. And at the end of this paragraph, when he says he offers no argument, the entire book is an argument.
Yeah,
like
exactly.
That's the whole work is the argument against determinism.
All the well, and plus even more than the logical problems is the theological and exegetical problems, which we go through on the program all the time. Sure. But you're right. He's making an argument as to why theistic determinism does not provide a significant capacity to choose. And to state, well, he doesn't make any argument for that. Yeah, like you said, the entire book is making that case, that it's not a significant capacity to choose if what compatibilists say is true is true. Anyway, so he goes on, he goes, further examples of beg questions and prejudicial caricatures are in no short supply. So, okay, for those watching, a begged question is when you presume true the very point up for debate. And there can be a complex question, you've heard it, say, well, have you stopped beating your wife yet? Something like that. That's a kind of a classic example of that. Or have you stopped cheating on your taxes yet? Well, that presumes you have been cheating on your taxes. And the arguer may say, well, wait, you haven't established that I'm cheating on my taxes yet. Why would you ask me if I stopped cheating on my taxes if you haven't established that I have cheated on my taxes yet? And so this accusation is oftentimes leveled against an opponent based upon one, like you said, question pulled, or one statement pulled out of its context, as if he hasn't made his argument in other portions of the book. And so sometimes Lennox will make an argument earlier in the book establishing, for example, that theistic determinism denies human culpability. And then he'll restate that later, referring back to the argument that he made before. And then Anderson will pluck it out of its context and say, well, Lennox is just begging the question. Well, no, he's already made his point. He's already made that argument. And now he's drawing the conclusion based upon that argument. Prejudicial caricatures. This is another way of just saying, well, he doesn't paint it in the way that we would want it to be painted. The bigger question, whether it's a caricature or not, is it true or not? In other words, I can say something that doesn't sound very palatable, but it can still be true. And I have examples of this in an article online where, you have political speak like this all the time, where you might say something like, well, the FBI agent, captured the criminal and got the information from him to stop to thwart the terrorist attack. Well, that sounds real palatable. That sounds real great, politically correct. Everybody's going to amen and say, great, good job, way to go, FBI. But he could have said, the FBI agent tackled a 16-year-old African-American boy, broke both of his kneecaps and stuck a gun in his mouth and tortured him until he finally gave up information, which he did to 4 or 5 other suspects in the exact same way, some of which who were innocent, had nothing to do with this. In order to thwart the plot of the terrorist. Well, okay, so both of those statements are talking about the same exact event. One of them is going into real deep detail, and one of them is just saying the basics, in a politically correct way. And so both of them are true, but one of them is acceptable to the audience. The other one's not acceptable to the audience. Well, okay, if it's true, period. And that's why I go to the quotes like from Talbot's book and Piper's book and read where it talks about, they admit God brought to pass the rape of children for his own glorification. That's their verbiage. And the reason I do that is because I don't want to be accused of caricatures or just emotionalism, because these are things that they themselves are willing to ascribe to. They're saying it themselves. And so you've got to be a good judge here and say, okay, yes, I agree. There may be times in which Lennox doesn't say something in a way that sounds palatable or politically correct for a Calvinist ear, but is it untrue? In other words, is it a real misrepresentation of what Calvinism actually believe and say? Or is it something you just don't like it? You just don't like it put it that way because it makes it too abundantly clear that our view is objectionable. That's, I think, the bigger issue. Go ahead.
What I don't like is prejudicial, because to be prejudiced is to make up your mind before you've actually done the work. And so I would say he's assuming that the caricatures, in other words, just the explanations of some of the doctrines, are prejudiced, that he just automatically has some inherent motivation against Calvinism or against determinism, and that he hasn't actually done the work. It might be a judicial caricature. It might be something that he has judged based on actual evidence. The other thing I think is begging the question. The whole article is written almost as if he's critiquing a debate between two people. I mean, it is a fallacy when you're in a debate with someone, but in a book, you basically have a thesis, and then the thesis is inherent throughout the rest of the book, and you are going back to it, and you do have one point of view. And so is it begging the question, since Romans 9 is where everyone loves to go, when the invisible interlocutor says, who are you, O man, to question God? Well, yeah, it's a question to set up the response that Paul wants to give. And Lennox is doing the same, but that's just a common way to put together the narrative of a book.
Right.
And so again, it's just a strange critique to me.
Yeah, I totally agree. That's a good insight on that. And plus, when we say caricature, like let's give an example from the other side, like the God getting into DeLorean and traveling into the future. That would be caricature because it's not true. It's just not true. Or God looking through the quarters of time, as if God has to gain information by peering into the future to see what will happen, versus more of an eternal now perspective that God knows all things because he is omnipresent. He's all places at all times. And his eternal nature is outside of time, like the C.S. Lewis or Boethian model might say. That's a caricature to say that God's like peering through the future, like in a crystal ball. That's more of a caricature. Because that's not true of our system. And so there's a difference between saying something that's not palatable, that's true of the system, versus caricaturing the system itself. Both sides can do it. I'm sure there are examples of Calvinists being caricatured, but I don't think that anything that Lennox does reaches that level personally. So here's some of the examples. He uses theistic determinists think God is the irresistible cause of human behavior, whether good or bad. Okay. Is that true or false? What do you think, Clayton? Is it true that theistic determinists, do their claims, are the claims of John Piper consistent with this? In other words, are the claims of John Calvin consistent with the fact that God is the irresistible or necessity determiner of human behavior, whether good or bad?
Yeah, I mean, I would make the case that anything soft determinism, compatibilism, at the end of the day, that statement is true for all of them at its logical conclusion.
Right. And so are we being therefore, is he making a caricature to say that? In other words, I don't, this is what I'm trying to get to, where,
yeah.
How can something be called a caricature? Okay, so go back over here. You can see that up on the screen, can't you? John Calvin,
yeah.
John Calvin's quote there.
Yeah.
Okay, so creatures are so governed by the secret counsel of God that nothing happens but what he has knowingly and willingly decreed. Okay, so that's John Calvin, Institutes of Christian Religion. Thieves and murderers and others evildoers are instruments of divine providence being employed by God himself, the Lord himself, to execute judgments which he has resolved to inflict. Another quote, we hold that God is the disposer and ruler of all things, that from the remotest eternity, according to his own wisdom, he decreed what he was to do, and now by his proper executes what he has decreed. Whence we maintain that by his providence, not heaven and earth and inanimate creatures only, also the counsels and wills of men. So, okay, the wills of men are so governed as to move exactly in the course which he has destined. Okay, so how is that a caricature? Destiny is irresistible cause, that's destiny, that's determination of what the human will behave, how the human will behave, whether good or evil. You just talked about thieves and murderers. That's good and evil, right? Disposer of all things. All things would include evil, right? Exactly in the course that he has destined. Okay, so how are we misrepresenting Calvinism when the namesake himself has defined what Calvinism is? The devil and the whole train of the ungodly are in all directions held by the hand of God as with a bridle, so that they can neither conceive any mischief or plan what have conceived, or have much soever have they have planned, move a single finger. So moving a single finger would be behavior, right?
Right.
Move a single finger to perpetrate unless insofar as he permits, nay. So he didn't stop with permission. He didn't, that's where we would say he permits people to do what they do. Okay. Permits free will. It's what free will is all about, is permission. Okay. Nay, unless insofar as he commands, that they are not only bound by his fetters, but are even forced to do him service. It is very wicked merely to investigate the causes of God's will, for his will, and rightly ought to be, the cause. There's the cause. There's the word cause. He didn't like the word causal determinism, but that's the word of their own scholar. The cause of all things that are. Is rape something that is? Would all things include rape, murder, evil? Okay, so I can keep going, quote after quote after quote after quote, just to show that we're not misrepresenting anybody here.
Yeah, I'm actually wondering, a caricature is, it's basically when they highlight the most striking features of someone, right? So if they make a caricature of me, I've got a big nose, they're gonna make my nose like abundantly clear that is the striking feature of my face. And that's almost what Lennox has done. Determinism is one of the most striking features of Calvinism. And, some people believe, I see it through the life of Augustine as the foundational belief where all the other 5 points of Calvinism were birthed out of. And so, yeah, Lennox is highlighting one of the most striking features of the Calvinistic system, and he's calling it into the light, and he's making people wrestle with it, and people are having to try and think through responses. But then even on just this first bullet point, beg, question, and prejudicial caricature, and then he says exactly what theistic determinism is.
Right.
So
yeah.
yeah,
And that happens all the time. I mean, the fact that James White reposted this, I mean, he implicitly is saying he agrees with what it's saying here. So you have people doing this, even leading Calvinists doing this all the time. So, okay, Paul Helm's claim that all events are under the direct control of God is apparently extreme deterministic position. Okay, I'm not sure why that's a caricature or a question begging, but he's stating his view that Paul Helm's view of Calvinism, theistic determinism, is an extreme position or a deterministic position. Because I think if I remember that portion of the book, he's contrasting Paul Helm with some other softer determinists, just like I've done here by showing Piper and Calvin's view as compared to Anderson's.
Yeah, it feels like Anderson should agree with that one, because he's saying in the front portion of this that we're not all extreme determinists. And now he's saying calling it extreme is also a caricature. And so it feels like even within the first 2 bullet points, there's conflict in what he's trying to address.
Right. Okay, so he goes on, theistic determinists imply that God takes over and directly controls the molecules in my arm. Okay, theistic determinists imply, so he uses the word implication here. So he's not saying they come right out and say this, that he's saying that the claims of theistic determinism imply that God takes over, maybe brings about the molecules in my arm, brings about the movement or the behavior of the molecules in my arm. Same basic things that we just read Calvin and Piper saying. He just maybe uses a little bit different vernacular, but
yeah, I can't speak to that because I don't know the statements, but I do know I watched John Piper talk about pouring his soda and just watching in wonder, knowing that every bubble was placed exactly where it was by God's divine decree. So I mean, it's not outside of the realm of possibility.
Well, there's another one where he talks about the little dust particles that you see floating in the air through the window light, and he said how God is meticulously in His providence has controlled every single dust mite, and then he goes on to say, and including the actions and choices of creatures, everything is within His control, direct control, His decisive cause, according to that article. Okay, so genuine human freedom means a real capacity to act independently of God's direct control. So again, it sounds like Lennox is just telling you what genuine freedom is in his mind, and what I think most people would understand as genuine freedom is having a capacity, the moral capacity to act independently of what God is controlling you to act. And on compatibilism, as read on monergism.com site and as read from the leading Calvinistic sources, there is no independence there. There's no independence between your will and the sovereign will. Sovereign will is what determines the human will. So how is that a mischaracterization? There is no independence. So I don't know. I don't see any problem with that one. Theistic determinists hold that God, quote, fixes human destiny like a master chess player or puppeteer, irrespective of the responses of the humans involved. And he goes on to say, Lennox here commits the all too common mistake of conflating determinism and fatalism. Well, okay. What is fatalism? Let's just look it up. Okay, I'm gonna put it up here. Okay, fatalism. Here it is. Dictionary, just basic Webster's dictionary. All right. So I know it's not a huge scholarly source or anything of that nature, and so people are always going to have issues if you just pull something off of a basic Webster's dictionary. But what is fatalism? A doctrine that events are fixed in advance. So let's stop right there. Okay. Events fixed in advance. Is that consistent with compatibilistic determinism? I would say, yeah, all events are fixed in advance on compatibilistic determinism. I don't know how that's not true. So that human beings are powerless to change them. Okay. Are human beings able to change events that God has determined before the foundation of the world? No. Okay. Now, usually what people talk about when they talk about fatalism is that you act as if determinism is true. In other words, fatalism is living out your life as if everything's determined. And so it's almost like if you live as a consistent determinist, then you're a fatalist.
Right.
And so you have to live like determinism is not true, i.e. that you can affect the future, but believe like you can't. And so fatalists are people who are consistently living like determinism is true, whereas fatalists are true determinists, like the Calvinistic determinists, are living like they make a difference in the world. And of course, this is the irony of all ironies. Calvinists who become fatalistic do so by God's sovereign decree. And
Right.
so if people become fatalistic, it's because God decreed for them to become fatalistic. And so that, again, is the root of the whole problem at the very onset, is that ultimately people who fall into fatalism are doing so by deterministic means.
I think the only problem I really have, the biggest problem I have, is that the determinist God is far from a master chess player. I think in a provisional view that God is certainly the master chess player, because there's actually freedom on the other side of the board, and he still wins every time and still accomplishes his purpose. The deterministic God is like the worst chess player of all time. He's like me. Like I can't win a chess game unless I'm playing myself. The only problem with playing yourself is you also always lose. And that's where I think when people actually come to the logical end of Calvinism, a lot of people are turned away when they realize that for God to play both sides of the chessboard has some very real implications, specifically about the nature of God.
Yeah. Well, look at this. I agree. I think that's very true. This is interesting. I just pulled this up. It's fatalism and determinism compared, and this is actually a place that calls free will an illusion. Which, by the way, it's funny that he doesn't take that. People don't call free will an illusion on his view, but some of them do, obviously. So they give us a comparison of fatalism and determinism here. Okay, so if it is fated for you to recover from this illness, then you will recover whether or not you call a doctor. Likewise, if you are fated not to recover, you will not do so whether you call a doctor or not. But either it is fated that you will recover from this illness, or it is fated that you will not recover. Therefore, it is futile to consult a doctor. Okay, so that's fatalism on their view, as contrasted to determinism, which is what I think Anderson is arguing for. If you are caused to recover from this illness, calling a doctor might be part of that causality. Likewise, if you are caused not to recover, not calling the doctor might be part of that causality. This is when they say God ordains not only the ends, but also the means. So if God ordains your getting cured from the illness, it may be that he also caused you to call the doctor so as to be cured from your illness. But either it is that you will be caused to recover from this illness, or you will be caused not to recover. Since calling a doctor might be the cause of your recovery, it isn't futile to consult a doctor. But here's the underlying portion that they don't ever seem to address. The way you react, fatalistically or through determinism, is determined by God. So if you end up not calling the doctor because you're fated to die either way, as some people erroneously do, if God wants to heal me, he's going to heal me. It's all determined anyway. It's all fated. And then their kid dies because of the act fatalistically. But why did they do that? Well, because God decreed for them to. And so you ultimately got fatalism being played out because God determined their fatalism. And so you're not getting away from the problem. And also you're getting back to the issue of, evangelism, for example. God determines the ends as well as the means. That means he determines the evangelism as well as the results of evangelism. And so we're not trying to say you shouldn't evangelize. You should evangelize because you might be the causal means by which God has decreed for one of his elect to be saved. But that doesn't answer the question as to whether or not, if you personally are involved in evangelism, as to whether someone will be saved or not. Because ultimately, if you choose to act fatalistically and not to be involved in evangelism, it is because God determined the means that you would not be involved in evangelism. So, I mean, they're not getting away from the problem, in my estimation, at least by trying to draw a distinction between fatalism and determinism, because God is the determiner of fatalists. Anyway.
Yeah, I mean, whether or not you call the doctor or don't call is outside of your control on either system.
Right.
I mean, if
Yep.
you're not in charge of your preference or choices, then
Okay, so theistic determinists maintain that human free will is an illusion. Okay, so it's funny that I actually just cited a source that does call it an illusion. And so he's calling that a caricature. I think that's kind of funny. Only if one defines free will in the prejudicial way that Lennox does. Prejudicial meaning, I guess, differently than I do. I don't know. Okay, so dozens of other examples could be drawn, he says, from the rest of the book, but the point is made. Before the Bible has even been opened, before a single text has been examined, the deck has been stacked. Now, this is what you talk about prejudice. This assumes that John Lennox didn't confront the text or hasn't read through scripture in order to come to his definition of freedom of the will and responsibility. That's prejudicial. That you're assuming that you know what John Lennox did to prepare in writing of his book, or the order he went in his discerning of what's true and what's not. It almost is like he's saying, okay, he didn't even open a Bible before he came up with his decision of what compatibilism / determinism / free will is all about. And that's obviously not fair to John Lennox and his process. You have no idea what his process was.
Yeah.
Compatibilism has been ruled out as a priori. Real freedom is libertarian freedom. Any form of determinism undermines moral responsibility. And since the Bible clearly affirms our moral responsibility, it must teach something other than theistic determinism. The God of theistic determinism cannot be the God of the Bible. It's no exaggeration to say that nearly all the problems with Lennox's arguments in the book can be traced to these missteps in the first 2 chapters. The way he defines terms and frames the issue predetermines his conclusions. Now, we went through all his examples, and I don't see any example that meets this standard of being so prejudiced and or fall into the question of the fallacy of question begging, or so caricatured that it's untrue. So all the examples he gave, and I'm assuming he picked out the best examples here.
Yeah.
And we just went through every example and showed how scholars themselves, from his own perspective, have said exactly, almost word for word, the very things that he calls prejudicial and caricature.
Yeah, his issue isn't with Lennox alone. His issue is with anyone who is consistent with this philosophical idea. Monergism.com is just being consistent, and it says if you believe in real free will, or any free will, that you're not a compatibilist, you're inconsistent. And John Piper is eradicating the idea of free will. And so, the issue, and to your point, he quotes Piper in here, and so he obviously holds him in high regard enough to use him as a source for this article. But yeah, he's caught in between anyone who's being consistent with compatibilism.
Yeah, I agree. I think you're exactly right. His problem's not just with Lennox; it's with everyone who represents theistic determinism in the way that Lennox does. And so that's definitely true. Let's jump into chapter 3. We may not go much further just because it's getting long, but I wanted to try to get through some of this here a little bit further. Are you doing okay on time?
Yeah.
Okay. Chapter 3 surveys what Lennox takes to be the moral problem with theistic determinism. The problem is basically twofold. First, theistic determinism implies that God is, quote, actively involved in evil. Okay, so I'm assuming Anderson is rejecting that God is actively involved in evil because evil is directly caused by God. Okay, so What does it mean to be actively involved? To bring something about for his glory, is that being actively involved? Directly caused, is decisively caused, as Piper puts it. Is that a better way? If Lennox would have said decisively caused instead of directly caused, and if he would have said brought about evil for his glory instead of actively involved in evil, would Anderson fold up and say, "Oh, I'm wrong. He is rightly representing us now"? See, that's the whole point, is that there's no significant difference between Lennox's verbiage and that of the people he's critiquing. Right. But yet Anderson's acting like he's critiquing somebody other than the theistic determinists. or he's misrepresenting them somehow.
Yeah, and I think, my biggest concern, more than just intramural discussion among theologians, I'm always concerned about the, people in their early 20s who are in Bible school and seminary, and it's not a small thing for John Piper to be in agreement with actually our take on the implications of determinism, because he is the primary person that people are going to and listening to and reading and studying, in my experience anyway, going and actually studying theology in school. I mean, he is like the biggest hitter out there, and he's coming to these very conclusions that he's calling a prejudiced caricature.
Yeah, and that's the thing is, if Lennox is only, if he writes the book and he's only confronting John Piper's Calvinism and that's it, that's still a worthy book, because John Piper's influence is that huge, at least in Western Christianity today and in our worlds. But Lennox doesn't limit it, obviously, just to Piper. He does broaden the scope beyond Piper. But even if he did only focus on Piper's Calvinism, this would not be prejudicial. This would not be caricature or straw manning in any way, because we've shown words that almost are exactly the same as what that of Piper. Okay, so he goes on and says, second, theistic determinism implies a fatalistic view. Again, what is fatalism? It's acting consistently within a deterministic worldview is what it is. It's, in other words, it's acting like determinism is true versus acting like it's not true. So a fatalistic view of predestination, such as that if I'm going to be saved, I will be saved, and I can do nothing about it either direction. Okay, let's stop here for a second. Can a reprobate do anything about whether they go to heaven or hell? If somebody right now who's living, who's not chosen for salvation, Christ did not die for them, can they do anything about whether they're going to heaven or hell? Objectively speaking, no.
Yeah, it's just a strange point to make. I mean, I don't know if you hold to any form of Calvinism, how you could write this as if you don't believe it.
I don't. I'm trying to say, okay, then Anderson, tell us what thing, you say he can do no thing. Okay, what thing could a reprobate do to determine the direction? What can, you say can do nothing. So what thing can he do then? So, because you're obviously implying he can do something about it, and therefore, what is it that he can do about it?
Yeah, I mean, to follow his thought further into the paragraph, he says our eternal destiny does depend on the choices that we make. I feel like if I was a Calvinist reading this, I would be concerned that Anderson is questioning the sovereignty, as I've defined it as a Calvinist, of God. I mean, what does that mean, that our eternal destiny does depend on our choices? That sounds awfully synergistic.
Yeah, let's read it. Let's go on. It says, as I've already observed, theistic determinism as such doesn't commit one to the idea that God directly causes evil. Okay, so you can be a theistic determinist without believing God directly causes evil. But does he ever tell us what that means? In other words, he seems to take the bite out of determinism, but never replaces it with a real meaning. So he obviously believes theistic determinism doesn't mean that God directly causes all things, even though other theistic determinist scholars say that God directly causes all things, decisively causes all things. So he disagrees with Piper on that view. Fine. Okay. So what does he mean then? Does he mean that God permits evil and then turns it for good, like Piper denies? Well, then tell us that. Show us that. Make your case for that. But he doesn't say that. He just says it doesn't commit them to the idea that God directly causes evil. And Calvinists have almost without exception denied any such implication. Yet we've just shown John Calvin and Piper not only implying it, but saying it outright, that he's the decisive cause of everything, all even preferences and choices of men, decisively causing. Again, so how can you say Calvinists almost without exception when John Calvin himself and John Piper the most influential Calvinists living today have said exactly the opposite of what you're implying, of what you're saying.
Yeah, and I mean the primary and secondary causes, in my experience anyway, when you push a Calvinist to say, well, then is God not sovereign of secondary causes? Well, of course he is. He is sovereign over all.
He is just as much in decisive control over a secondary cause as he is a primary. And so this is meaningless. It's almost like the desire thing. Okay, you're free as long as you're acting according to your desires. Well, what causes your desires? Well, God does. Okay, so in what significant way are you different than a hard determinist? None.
Right.
Because even on hard determinism, God determines your desires because he determines everything.
Right.
So you're not saying anything by saying there's primary and secondary causes. It's like it's like, okay, Uriah is killed by David. Well, he's not primarily killed by David. David didn't wield the knife.
Yeah, he wasn't even on the battlefield. How could David be in trouble for this?
Right. But obviously David's the man. He's the guilty party. Why? Because he's the primary decisive cause of Uriah's death. He's linked to it, even though he's not the first mover of the death of the death of Uriah in that sense. He's the one who intended it. He's the one who brought it to pass.
And David is sovereign. David's sovereign over his kingdom. So does that mean that when he made the command that the person that was in charge of the army literally lost their ability to make a decision about that? Like, are they found not guilty because they were just following orders or had the desire to please the king? I mean, it's like all of the implications, like John said earlier, when you put them into a real world scenario, they all just start to implode on themselves.
Right. And also it's ironic that you just use the word command there, because David's the sovereign over his nation. He's sovereign over his army. He decides whether they pull back or they go forward or whatever. He's the decreer of it. That's what command is, to decree something. So it's just funny when you use the word decree there, because it's ultimately David decreeing his army to do something that would cause the death of Uriah. And yet Uriah is still seen as the guilty party for this thing. So saying that something's a primary and secondary cause doesn't remove the culpability of the one bringing the decree. And just to ad hoc, just claim out of nowhere, oh, well, with God, it does. Okay.
Right.
Well, make your case biblically then. Show us where God accepts himself from these basic rules of right and wrong and good and evil, and we'll discuss that. But if his good is our bad and our bad is his good, as C.S. Lewis puts it, then we can say we worship we know not what. We might as well worship an all-powerful demon, if that's the case, because he has no measure of what we would call goodness. He goes on to say, furthermore, Calvinism is an expressly non-fatalistic form of determinism, since it affirms that our eternal destiny does depend on the choices we make, is what you were first referring to earlier. Okay, so get this. Calvinism affirms that our eternal destiny does depend on the choices we make. But who determines the choices we make? Who determines the choices we make? Your eternal destiny depends on the choices we make, but who determines the choices that we make? Let's go back to Piper's article. Never is man the ultimate or decisive cause of his preferences and choices. God is decisive. How much more clear can it be? I don't know. What's at stake in the Calvinistic Arminian debate is not whether our choices make a difference. Of course they do. But how those choices are related to God's eternal decree. Now, I would agree with that. Well, how are God's choices related to eternal decree? Does he give us an answer to that? Piper does. Piper tells us exactly how God's eternal decree is related to our choices. He determines them by his decree. He causally determines them, decisively controls them by his decree. But Anderson doesn't tell us how he differs with Piper or Calvin or Paul Helm or any of the other leading theistic determinists. He just leaves us, I guess, in limbo, thinking that we're supposed to put the pieces together, but say, hey, it's not that. I don't know. I don't think he gives us a better answer in this article, at least. He goes on, unfortunately, once again, Lennox demonstrates that he doesn't really grasp. This is always fun to me. He doesn't really grasp the Calvinist position. This guy's IQ is off the charts. And so is Calvinism that difficult? And I don't claim to be a smart guy. I've told people I'm not a scholar. I'm not an academic in the academic world of all the, philosophers that sit around with, multiple degrees, like, the Ken Wilsons of the world, like who is a orthopedic hand surgeon and knows like 9 languages, that kind of guy. But I'm not stupid. Okay. I adhered to, and I held to, and I promoted the Calvinistic tulip systematic for a good 10 years of my life, actually converting quite a few people to adopt Calvinism. And apparently I can't grasp it either. John Lennox, one of the clearly brightest people to ever walk the face of the earth, and William Lane Craig, both these men just can't get it. It's just that, what does it take to be able to grasp this doctrine? Because unless you accept it, you must not be able to grasp it or understand it. It seems like that seems to be the position of many Calvinists.
I feel like one of Calvinism's strong point is that as long as you don't go past the first layer of instruction, it's actually really succinct and really easy to follow. I mean, you walk from T to P in tulip, and it does make sense if you can buy into it. I think what is hard to grasp is when you ask the second, third, fourth, fifth layer of questions in regard to how those things logically play out, and how you see such just clear contradictions in scripture, especially about things like limited atonement and unconditional election. And all of a sudden, what you have to be able to grasp is the mystery, and to grasp how this is right. And it might not line up, but it'll line up in heaven, and we'll all figure it out there. And it just, you've brought this up a lot, but then how does Jesus pull a child up and have the expectation that with their humility that we should be like them, that we should, it's interesting. And obviously we poke fun at, you just don't understand Calvinism. But it really is a sad state. And you compare Anderson to Piper, and Anderson doesn't understand Piper's form of Calvinism, and Piper doesn't understand Anderson's form, and we don't understand Anderson's form. And he's really giving Lennox a hard time for at least being clear, but he's never being clear about what his actual positions are.
Right. Which goes back to the 1970s too, when John Piper wrote an article against J.I. Packer, who probably is taking more of an Anderson approach, which is really appealing to an antinomy. This is true. God determines everything, right, but men are still responsible. We just don't know how it works. And it's a mystery that's inscrutable mystery, as he refers to it as, these kinds of things. And Piper comes along and says, no, it's not an antinomy. He introduces what he views as compatibilism, which is some of the quotes that I provided there on the screen. And so you've got Packer disagreeing with Piper, or Piper really disagreeing with Packer. Packer is the senior of the two, and has obviously gone on to be with the Lord now. But that's the same kind of things that we have throughout the history of this debate, I guess is what you say,
right.
Is this issue of Calvinists disagreeing with themselves over these kinds of issues, none of which I guess can really grasp the other one's perspective if they happen to disagree with it. It seems to be the major problem.
Yeah.
So this is interesting. He simply, speaking of Lennox simply assumes without argument that the theistic determinism has objectionable implications and dismisses it on that prejudicial basis. Like you said earlier, his entire book is making that argument. Why he would say he's simply assuming theistic determinism is objectionable when he writes chapters on why theistic determinism, by the actual claims of theistic determinists, is objectionable. It makes no sense why you would say he did that without argument. Plus, even Calvinists, Piper has an article and a broadcast on YouTube talking about how objectionable he found Calvinism when he was first introduced to it. Sproul talks about how objectionable Calvinism was to him when he first introduced it. So it seems like to me, Anderson, if he was being kind of intellectually honest about this, wouldn't say that theistic determinism doesn't have some objectionable claims, but instead just admit, yeah, theistic determinism is objectionable, but here's why it's biblical and why you should accept those objections or accept it as what it is, even though you have objections to it. Again, kind of a strange way to approach this, instead of just admitting, yes, the claims of Calvinists are objectionable, but the reason they're objectionable is this, and the reason we should accept them despite their objections and swallow the difficult pill of double predestination or reprobation or whatever else that we have objections to, is because the Bible said so. That would be, I think, a stronger approach for Anderson. Chapter 4 sets out Lennox's reason for avoiding terms like Calvinist, hyper-Calvinist, Reformed, radical Reformed. He offers some wise counsel about avoiding partisan quarrels, blah, blah, blah. I'm going to jump ahead just because that wasn't really real weighty there. Part 2, the theology of determinism. Chapter 5 attempts to focus the issue under debate. Lennox grants that Scripture clearly teaches doctrines that can reasonably be described by the terms God's sovereignty and human responsibility, even though neither of these expressions occurs in the Bible. The problem is that people overemphasize one or the other of these two doctrines. I don't doubt that Lennox believes he's offering a balanced framing of the issue, but even here, he cannot help begging the question and caricaturing his opponents. Again, the accusation of caricaturing and question begging arises. So obviously, he's making his argument that he believes Scripture teaches human responsibility and sovereignty. We talk about the fact that we affirm both, obviously, God's sovereignty and human responsibility, but we define sovereignty as meaning God can do whatever he wants to do, not that he is deterministically controlling everything. And we define human responsibility, silly us, as people having the ability to respond to the sovereign God. And so that's how we think they're compatible, and there's no mystery problem there. The only time that human responsibility becomes a mystery with divine sovereignty is if you define sovereignty as meticulous control of what humans respond and how humans respond. That's when the dilemma is created. If you just drop determinism out of sovereignty, which is assumed, in my estimation, you don't have any problem with the idea of human responsibility. You may have a problem with omniscience, and there are answers to that problem, but you don't have a problem with sovereignty. You might have a problem with how does God know something, and yet we are still free to choose to do what we do. There is some philosophical mystery there, but it's not the same problem as theistic determinism. The first group hold that the tension may be resolved solely in terms of God's sovereignty, effectively denying any real role for human responsibility, as God is the direct cause of everything. This is theistic determinism. Okay, so he's calling this a caricature again and question begging. This is, I guess, he's referring to a Lennox quote here. It says the first group hold that the tension may be resolved solely in terms of God's sovereignty, effectively denying any real role for human responsibility, as God is the direct cause of everything. Again, he takes issue with saying that God is the direct cause of everything. I'm wondering if Anderson were here, if we asked him, do you believe God has decreed everything? I would imagine that he would say, yes, God has decreed everything. If I asked, has God determined everything? It sounds like he would say, yes, God has determined everything, but not causally determined it. And then if I were to ask, okay, what do you mean by that? Then we would get to the root of the problem, or the differences between he and Piper and Calvin, in other words. Do you think that's about right?
Yeah, I mean, again, he's obviously some kind of a moderate Calvinist, but he keeps saying Lennox is without argument, prejudicially. But I'm sure if I read Anderson's articles all the time, I would know more where he stood, and maybe he is just kind of banking on the fact that people have read his other work and know what flavor of Calvinist he is. But I don't. And so, he says our choice does determine our eternal destiny. Well, that doesn't sound like Calvinism to me. God not being in control of all things, that doesn't sound like consistent Calvinism to me. So yeah, it'd be interesting to press him. And I I probably won't read to find out what kind of Calvinist he is. But I within this article that seems to have caught a little bit of traction, and people reposting it and responding to it, he's really going after someone for not making their path clear, and his path is definitely not clear as well. Obviously, conflict even within other Calvinists.
Well, that's a really good point. Yeah, to accuse somebody, to accuse the person you're coming up against as not being clear on his perspective, and not offering any clarity of your own, sounds a lot like what James White did in a lot of our discussions. He seems to talk about flattening it out and those kinds of things, but then not giving a clear distinction of what he would hold to in contrast to what I've said. But let's I want to read just a little bit more here. There was a few more points that I wanted to get to. I know there's some towards the end of it. I can't remember. I should have marked them just so I could skip over some of this. He goes on to say, I trust the reader can see why this is objectionable. Theistic determinism as such doesn't entail that God is the direct cause of everything. So it obviously, direct cause versus decisive cause. Again, I don't know if that's semantical differences, but I don't know if he can give us again, if we had him here, we could ask him what would he say is decreative? What would he say is determinative, if not direct cause? Secondary causes, and how does that in any way help your situation? How does that bring you out from underneath the objections we're bringing by saying that there's secondary causes if God is quote unquote sovereign over secondary causes too? Furthermore, to assert that such a view, quote, effectively denies any real role for human responsibility patently begs the question in favor of incompatibilism. It doesn't beg the question if he's making a case for it. Begging the question means you're not bringing any arguments. You're just assuming your case. He's making his case through the entirety of the book through exegesis and logical constructs. So you can't skip over all of the arguments that he makes and then claim that he's begging the question because he's not bringing arguments.
Yeah, I mean, if you're reading
repeatedly,
if you're reading a book about the keto diet, and they keep saying Atkins actually will raise your, well, it's like they're begging the question in favor of keto. Of course they are. That's the entirety of the book, is a persuasion that their viewpoint is more accurate, more biblically centered, more reflective of the nature of God. And so I think that's a weak argument, because that is the thesis of his book. It's the title of his book is Counter to Determinism.
Yeah, that makes sense. Well, and just to use that, because he uses that argument to call it caricature and beg a question. He uses that argument dozens of times in this article, and that seems to be the crux of his entire case against Lennox, is that Lennox disagrees with me.
Right.
Okay, yeah, that's a kind of a given. Okay, so chapter 6 considers how the concepts. The biblical vocabulary considers how the concepts of foreknowledge, predestination, and election are represented in the Bible, or at least in the New Testament. Only one Old Testament text is cited. What might have been responsible linguistic survey degenerates into caricature and eisegesis. For example, on Lennox's reading, Matthew 22:14 turns out to mean, many are called, but few respond, while Acts 13:48 tells us, despite the passive participle in the Greek, that the Gentiles appointed themselves for eternal life. Okay, so here he's getting to some of the exegetical differences that he has with Lennox over these two passages. It sounds like you were turning your pages to get to something. You're welcome to comment on some of those exegetical points if you want to. I've produced articles and broadcasts on both of those passages.
Yeah, there's so much on your site, man. I don't know that it's really worth the time, but yeah, I mean, you're right. It's just, it's a difference. It's the duck and the rabbit. It's, it's whatever.
Right. And especially Acts 13:48, there's a ton of material there on the website, as well as a video. Matter of fact, there's a video, I think, that's exactly 13 minutes and 48 seconds long that happens to hit on Acts 13:48 there on our site, if you're interested in that. So it says the chapter closes with an argument borrowed from Wesleyan philosopher Thomas McCall to the effect that if divine determinism were true, then everyone would be saved, because God's universal loves and tells that he will do everything he can do to ensure that everyone freely accepts the gospel and is saved. Leaving aside the flaws in the argument itself, Lennox overlooks the fact that even on his non-deterministic view, God clearly isn't doing everything within his power to ensure that every human being freely accepts the gospel. Why doesn't God send gospel preaching angels into North Korea, for example? The point should be obvious. Calvinists and non-Calvinists alike have to concede that God has other purposes besides maximizing the number of people saved. First, I would say this is that the fact that Romans 1 actually touches on the very thing that he's hitting on is, how are people to be blamed if they don't have revelation? Paul answers that question by saying everyone does have sufficient revelation to believe. And therefore, God has made his truth abundantly known and sufficiently known so that anyone may reply to it or respond to it. And if they're faithful with a little bit of light of revelation, then he would bring them more light, more revelation, because that's what the scripture says he would do. So you've got Cornelius, for example, who had a smaller light of revelation. He believed in God. He feared the Lord. God sent him Peter from Joppa. And so God brings the eunuch Philip. God has a way of bringing the gospel to people who respond to the light of revelation that they've been given. And so on our view, we have an answer to this question. Maybe Anderson's just not aware of it. I'm not sure if Lennox holds the same view I do with regard to that, but I would assume he does based on the other answers that he has. But it just seems here Anderson's not aware of our view of the universal witness of Christ through revelation or through general revelation, and that general revelation can lead someone to acknowledge God as God so as to receive the further light of the gospel revelation of Christ. Maybe he's just not aware of that perspective. I don't know.
Yeah, that's a really intense sentence, that God clearly isn't doing everything within his power to ensure that every human being freely accepts the gospel. And I just feel like, obviously, we go to the scripture a lot, but God, desires that all would be saved. And I just think through the whole of scripture and, God clothing Adam and Eve and putting a fiery sword and a cherubim to keep them from eating of eternal life, and choosing a people unto himself, and providing manna, and parting the waters, and clearing out the promised land until they chose to not follow God in that. And the cross, obviously, he sent his perfect son to die on a cross, and to say that he isn't doing everything so that people can come to know him. It's like, what more can you do than to give your son and to trade his life, his perfect life, for the life of, people who spit in the face of God minute after minute. So I don't know, man, I don't want to move into gaslighting territory or whatever, but I read that, and it really, man, that hit me. Like, that is a really big statement. And from our view, it just is like, how can we see God as doing anything less than just the ultimate act of love and the power of the gospel to bring that reality to all people, and our free choice as to whether or not we're going to spread that gospel and point other beggars to the source of our bread. So I don't know.
Well,
that was crazy to me.
Very well said, Clayton. Should write that down before you forget it. That's good stuff. Part 3 is essentially a multi-chapter critique of the Reformed doctrine of total inability, according to which fallen unregenerate people can do no spiritual good and cannot respond to the gospel invitation apart from special divine grace. This is one of the points I wanted to get to, because as you probably know, Clayton, having listened to the stuff, I harp on this quite regularly, even with our Arminian friends. So chapter 7 seeks to rebut 3 major arguments advanced to promote the idea that humans are by nature incapable of any response to God. Now, of course, any response, implicitly what he's saying is any positive response to God. Now, I put in the word positive there when I'm talking to people, because I've had enough Calvinists, nitpick me when I'm trying to do that. But he doesn't put the word positive response here. And so what does Anderson do? He nitpicks. This is why you'll almost always hear me say any positive response to God, because if you just say no response, then like the dead sinner, dead people don't respond in any way. So you would say no response, like a dead person would literally be. The way the Calvinists would say, well, there's no positive response to God. So I presume Lennox has in mind here a positive spiritual response, such as saving faith and repentance, since no Calvinist would claim that the unbeliever is incapable of any response to God. So there he hits on that point. even then, he seems unaware that the position he opposes isn't distinctly Calvinistic or determinist view. For example, the 5 article of the Remonstrance, which he gets into the Arminian doctrines, assert that the natural man, inasmuch as he is in the state of apostasy and sin, can of and by himself neither think, will, or do anything that is truly good, such as saving faith eminently is. This assertion was no accident. The Remonstrants were acutely sensitive to the charge of semi-Pelagianism. This is great. This is great right here, because this is exactly what I was talking with Roger Olson about. This is exactly what I confront my Arminian friends about, is semi-Pelagianism was introduced in the 15th century by Calvinists trying to boogeyman Molinists or non-Calvinists at the time that were growing in popularity. And what were they trying to do? Okay, you're not a full-on heretic here, but you're partly a heretic. And so we're going to pull up a council, an ancient council from 4th, 5th century that was primarily a debate over baptismal regeneration of infants, mind you. And we're going to pull that out of its context and say, okay, you people are siding with Pelagianism, not full-blown Pelagianism, but semi-Pelagianism. And so instead of biblically debating what you're claiming is true, we're going to instead just label you with a heretic name. It would be tantamount to me saying, well, you're semi-Manichaean Gnosticist. You're semi-Augustinian, okay? Because you don't agree with everything Augustinian theology says and teaches, because he believed in the baptismal regeneration of infants, for example. So you're not a full-on Augustinian, you're a semi-Augustinian. Well, you're also a semi-Gnostic, because the Gnostics of that day, the Manichaeans of that day, believed in more of a deterministic philosophy like you do. So semi-Pelagianism is just a made-up word. It's just a label, okay? And I go through it in my articles online, talking about, here's Matt Slick and Carm's definition of semi-Pelagianism. Here's how we differ with that definition, and therefore we don't even fit the definitions that they provide. But nevertheless, I'm always going to be charged, and so is every Arminian, mind you, going to be charged with semi-Pelagian. What's so funny about this is Arminians are almost always labeled semi-Pelagian by Sproul, Piper, and probably Anderson when we're not around. So is he trying to say that the Remonstrants succeeded in avoiding the label semi-Pelagian? I doubt it, because anybody who's not a Calvinist, i.e. a determinist, is a semi-Pelagian in the mind of what they have defined as semi-Pelagianism, because anything that's less than Calvinism is a semi-Pelagian on their view. You're not going to avoid the label by adopting a worldview that's not biblical. And that worldview that's not biblical is this idea that we can't respond to God's life-giving truth. It's just respond positively. I forgot the word positively there. We can't respond positively to God's appeals to be reconciled to fall, because we're born fallen and because God doesn't really want us. God didn't really select us. God didn't really die for us. That if you want to call that semi-Pelagian, I can't stop you from calling me semi-Pelagian. But historically, it's not accurate, for one. And two, it's meaningless. It's an appeal to an ancient council that means nothing. It's a made-up word to boogeyman your opponent. It'd be like me calling somebody semi-Hitlerin. You're kind of like Hitler, because Hitler loved his mom and you love your mom, so you're semi-Hitlerin. Yeah, I mean, it's just absolutely substancelessness, and it has no weight in the argument at all.
Well, and Anderson said earlier that our choices have a direct effect on our eternal destiny. I mean, that sounds awfully semi-Pelagian to me. You know, it's like there, even within his own moderate view of Calvinism, he's towing the waters of the very boogeyman that they use against everybody else. So I agree. Right. I think it's
so if it's the choice is real, like he said before, your choice is real, and they determine your destiny, which he also affirmed. Then why isn't that semi-Pelagianism? Well, the only reason it's not semi-Pelagianism is because God determined your choices, which he doesn't bring up or mention, because if he did, then he would have the same charge that he's trying to run from in the first place. So anyway, because he goes, in any event, it's disappointing that chapter 7 and 8 don't engage with any serious exegesis. Now, when a Calvinist says they don't engage with any serious exegesis, what they mean is the same thing James White means, is that his exegesis is different than my exegesis, so it must not be serious. Okay, congratulations.
Yeah,
Okay,
if you were serious, you would come to my understanding of it.
Yeah, if he was a serious exegete, then he would understand the Bible deterministically. But of course, let's keep in mind the little underpinning of this is the reason that we don't do serious exegesis is because God didn't decree for us to do serious exegesis if Calvinism is true. You got to always keep that in mind too, that the reason for John Lennox lack of seriousness in exegesis is because God decreed for him to be such. And yet you're still bringing rebuke as if Lennox is responsible for it. Congratulations. There's the crux of your the insane portion of it. And I say insane. I shouldn't say insane. That probably sounds a little bit overly derogatory, I guess. But it makes your brain just spin when you begin to think about all the different implications of that, because it's not only that, as one point to person out, is that God is also decreeing your response to my lack of serious exegesis. So, and it's just like this endless cycle of God decreeing arguments with himself over what he's decreed for us to believe about ourselves. And it just becomes mind-boggling. So the standard proof text for total inability, John 6:44, Romans 6, Romans 8, 1 Corinthians 2, Ephesians 2, instead of the doctrine and the arguments in support of it are repeatedly mischaracterized, which is another way of saying he disagrees with the way we exegete those texts, and so he's wrong. Chapter 9 offers a lengthy discussion of John 6:22 through 65, which is suspiciously predestinary in tone, but I'm trying to see here. Whatever it meant God the Father. No Calvinist thinks unconditional election. I wanted to get to one other point here, and I keep trying to find it. Okay, so he says here, no Calvinist thinks that unconditional election eliminates human responsibility. Okay. We understand that no Calvinist says out loud that their view of unconditional election means that people aren't going to be held responsible for their choices. Okay, we all understand that. However, what the argument is that unconditional election, the claims of your system that God has chosen certain individuals before the foundation of the world, and he's going to give them some effectual work of faith without which they cannot respond positively to the gospel. We're saying that view takes away any semblance of human responsibility, i.e., the ability of humans to respond to the revelation of God, because it's ultimately putting that response back onto God's decision, God's will. So that's our argument.
It's almost like he got auto-corrected from every to no. Like every Calvinist has to think that unconditional election eliminates human responsibility if they're being consistent. And I know that's not part of how it's presented, but I've had Calvinist pastors be very honest with me that they don't take people to the next levels of Calvinist understanding up front. You know, it's on Gospel Sunday, they're very provisionalist in their teaching. They're very free grace sounding in their teaching. Everyone can come, whosoever will. It's when you get into the sanctification process that you start learning these deeper truths of Calvinism. And I know people are showing up at my church who felt like they got, basically a bait and switch because Gospel Sunday sounded like, Jesus died for everyone. Everyone could come. Everyone can make a choice. But as they got more involved in Bible studies and spiritual formation classes, and they started learning the deeper truths of Calvinism, it didn't square at all with the message they actually received when they got there.
Right.
It just doesn't feel fair.
Yeah. And he goes on to say, he says, the Calvinist insists that divine determinism must be compatible with responsibility. How? How is it? Piper tells us how, but does Anderson? So because Piper and monergism.com tells us how they're compatible. They're compatible because human responsibility is defined as doing what one wants to do, desires, within given circumstances, which are determined by God, and that's how they're compatible. because we hold somebody responsible for doing what they want, even though those wants are determined by God. That's how it works under monergism.com and Piper's view. And so what is Anderson's response to that? You can say that they're compatible, but if you're not giving us any reason or basis on which they are compatible, then it's just an ad hoc claim. In other words, it's just out of the blue. Determinism and determinism and responsibility are just both compatible. They're both true. And I don't have to tell you why they're both true or how they're both true. I can just simply appeal to the mystery of how they're both true, and you're supposed to accept it, even though only by God's determination will you accept it. Only if God's decreed to accept this will you. It just, again, falls on itself. Once again, Lennox is simply taking incompatibilism for granted and insisting that the text must be interpreted in that light. Moreover, the axiom driving his argument that moral responsibility entails moral ability is fundamentally Pelagian. Bum, bum, bum. There's the boogeyman again. If I can't defeat him biblically or logically, I can always appeal to an ancient Catholic council that was debating over baptismal regeneration of infants. By the way, it was Pelagius that was saying that we should baptize believers, and it was Augustine that was saying that you're actually regenerated through infant baptism. Just in case you wanted to know who was on which side of that debate. So fundamentally Pelagian. So by the way, all Baptist Calvinists are semi-Pelagian because all Baptist Calvinists believe in believers' baptism versus baptismal regeneration of infants. So at least on that front, all Baptists that don't baptize their infants for the sake of baptismal regeneration, all of you are semi-Pelagian. If you want to go that way. Okay, so
I like where he starts in the article by saying that Lennox is this great defender of the faith, and he uses just his brilliant mind to go against atheists. And this argument, Calvinists insisting on something doesn't make it true. It doesn't have any bearing on the veracity of what you're insisting. I insist that A also be not A. That doesn't mean that it's true. It means I want it to be true. And Lennox would never go into an argument with someone and rely on something that he insists to be true to be good enough grounding to actually sway anyone's mind or anyone's opinion. And yet it just jumps from Calvinism insists this. I'm not going to tell you how or actually help you understand why that can be true or where that lines up biblically. And if you don't believe it, you're a heretic. And it's just it's a weak argument. And again, I want to give him the benefit of the doubt and say maybe he has a broad scope of work where he's already, it's like John 6. You have so many videos and articles on that. We kind of breeze through it, but he definitely doesn't do it any justice or give any real description within this article.
Right. Yeah, and he goes on to say, he says, as a consequence of his pre-commitments, Lennox is forced to reverse the explanatory relationship between the divine giving and the human coming. This is when he gets into John 6 again, which I think we've got so much articles and things on that I'll just refer the listeners to those to go understand what we would say about John 6. And to understand also, he says, I'll refrain from trying to get the reader's patience with further criticism of Lennox exegesis of John 6. Let me simply suggest that it could be an instructive exercise to compare his exposition with that of, say, D.A. Carson. So he's pretty much saying, go look at this Calvinist exegesis in order to get a better exegesis. And that's what I'm saying too. Go look at what we've provided online to see our exegesis in comparison. It goes on, Israel and determinism. Okay, this is when he gets into Romans 9 through 11. Of course, I wrote a book on the subject. I've got hours and hours of videos going through Romans 9. That's been one of my major focuses in my dissertation and other places that goes through this. So, and we've been going to 2 hours and 20 minutes or something like that. So I'm going to just stop there and refer people to our material on Romans 9 through 11 if you're wanting to see how we would take it and understand that the categories are different. Obviously, the reason we're not Calvinists is because we don't believe that Paul is addressing the same concerns as the Calvinists assume he is in Romans chapter 9. Lennox does an ample job in explaining his view with regard to the corporate view of election and the election to service. I think he does a good job going through that himself. He says a few things that I would probably have worded differently, just like I'm sure he would say of stuff I've said. But I think for the most part, he does a pretty good job explaining the overall context of those chapters in a pretty clear way. And I would love to push Anderson on the one point of chapter 11, especially, is that the same people in chapter 9 who are stumbling, according to chapter 9, they're into the chapter, they've stumbled over the stumbling stone. In chapter 11, he says, but they haven't stumbled beyond recovery.
Right.
So, in other words, the hardened Israelite that he's addressing in chapter 9 who've stumbled and been hardened are the same ones he says haven't stumbled beyond recovery, and that he hopes to provoke by envy to his ministry to the Gentiles so that they too will be saved, and that they may leave their unbelief so as to be grafted back in. And so it sounds like to me that the hardened stumbler in chapter 9 has hope of being saved, but yet if he's representing the reprobate of Calvinism, he wouldn't have hope of being saved because he would be somebody unconditionally elected for reprobation prior to the foundation of the world. And so whoever the stumbler is in Romans 9, who is being hardened, cannot be the reprobate of the Calvinistic system if it's true that they have not stumbled beyond recovery and that they could leave their unbelief and be grafted back in, as Paul himself concludes in chapter 11. So I'll leave that as kind of a thing to mull over.
The only other thing I saw was he calls Lennox incoherent because he goes from, why has God in his plan allowed Israel to reject the Messiah or hardened Israel? And he's talking about a nation. And then he starts talking about the individual roles in God's plan between Jacob and Esau. And so he calls that incoherent because he's talking on one hand about the nation, and then he's talking about individuals, and why would that switch? And I think it's just a category error, because if he understood it from, I think, our perspective, it never changes from the actual theme, which is the plan of God and the right for him to move his plan forward however he sees fit. And it was through individual patriarchs. And so he goes back there to continue making his case that God gets to do this however he wants to do it. And so he sees an incoherence there within Lennox's argument that isn't actually there. I think he's just making a category error.
Well, and I will say this, I do distinctly remember in my preaching class back at Hardin-Simmons as a young theology student, when I had first adopted Calvinism, I was probably 1 or 2 years into Calvinism at this time. And I was given the opportunity to read any chapter that I wanted to read because you had to do oral presentations. And so I chose, of course, Romans 9 to read. And I got up and I read Romans 9 with all the fervor that I could read it as a good, thoroughbred Calvinist. And there was a friend in the room who was more distinctly Arminian. And he says, "Oh man, you sound just like a Calvinist reading Romans 9 like that." And I said, "Hey, I just read it. If you probably have a problem with it, I just read it." And he said something to the effect of, "Well, it doesn't say what you think it says. It's not saying what you're thinking it's saying it." And I said, "I just read it. I didn't even, it says it plain and simple. It seems pretty clear to me." And then he gave me, and we were kind of in between classes, and he just gave me this brief little synopsis of what pretty much Lennox holds to, I would say. He talks about the nations, and then he talked about national. And I remember, and I just, what's true of nations is true of individuals. That's incoherent. That doesn't make any sense. It's obviously about salvation. And I remember saying that to him in the hallway. And it did to me, it sounded, what he was saying sounded incoherent because I had not ever drawn the conclusions to the original sources. In other words, the 13 different times that Paul is quoting from Old Testament texts, I never went back and looked at those Old Testament texts to see what they meant in those contexts to understand what Paul might have been quoting them for. And ironically, it's people like James White, who says in debates, don't run off to the Old Testament text, use the apostolic interpretation. In other words, interpret like a Calvinist, because if you run off to the Old Testament text, it might become too clear that that's not what the intentions of those authors were when quoting, for example, "I will have mercy on whom I will have mercy. I'll have compassion on whom I have compassion. If you understand that in that context, God was talking about having compassion and mercy on Israel because they had built a golden calf. And in order for his name to be glorified through this nation, he would have to refrain from punishing them by destroying them. Well, if I'm not going to destroy these people because I've promised Abraham it's through them that I will accomplish my purpose and my name will be glorified through them, then to mercy them doesn't mean to effectually save them. To mercy means to refrain from destroying them when they deserve to be destroyed, which goes right back to the very first question. Has God's purpose failed through Israel? No, God can show them mercy when he wants to show them mercy, meaning even when they're rebellious, God can refrain from punishing and destroying this people when it serves his purpose to do that. But you know what else he can do in order to accomplish his purpose? He can harden them. He can do like a police sting analogy, our operation. He can blind them in their rebellion and actually mold already hardened lump of clays into vessels that he uses for his own glorification to shout things like, crucify him. And that God can use hardened individuals in their callous rebellion and blind them, give them a spirit of stupor to ensure that they remain calloused, remain blinded, that they crucify the Messiah, that they allow the ingrafting of the Gentiles, and that God is perfectly just to do this. Who are you to question God? Oh man, he did this to Pharaoh. He hardened Pharaoh in his sinful rebellion so as to bring about the first Passover. It's exactly what he's doing to you. And who are you, oh man, to question him if he does that? Once that clicked, and I understand that's what Paul's talking about when he's talking about mercying and hardening people. He's not talking about individually effectually saving some people and individually effectually condemning people into eternity reprobated in hell. No, it's not. That's not the contrast. He's talking about how God brings about his purposes through the nation of Israel by showing the mercy when it serves his purpose, or by hardening when it serves his purpose. And who are you to question God if he does this? He has the right to define his covenant people however he wants to, and he has the right to use hardened criminals, just like the police have the right to use hardened criminals however they want to bring about their purposes. God has the sovereign right to use already calloused individuals in Israel to do what he wants them to do. And if he wants to save barbarian Gentiles who are prostitutes and tax collectors through faith, who are you to question him? And if it's not through works and running after the law and willing and striving after the law, and if he wants to save them instead through faith in Christ Jesus, who are you to question him in his judgment to do that? Once I saw that, once that clicked, it all fell together. And I was like, oh my goodness, I saw the duck versus the rabbit versus the duck. I saw both sides. And I go, oh, well, that makes so much more freaking sense when I get to chapter 11. I mean, that just like the lights came on, and I thought to myself, I remember thinking back to my friend in the hallway, and I remember thinking to myself, man, he must think I'm an idiot. Because I didn't let him get the words out. I didn't even try to understand where he was coming from, because to me he was just being incoherent, because he's not following the text the way that I follow the text, and therefore he must just be stupid, or he just must not really like the Bible, and he's just making up stuff as it goes along, or whatever, you know.
Yeah, I think what happens sometimes, and I was at Howard Payne. We can still be friends, but I was right down the road, and let's not do that.
Hey,
but
I work for the denomination. I've worked for the denomination now, so I have to represent all the.
You were there. You were at chapel the other day. I saw that.
We super summer. We're friends with we're friends with all of our Baptist institutions.
There we go.
I went to Hardin Simmons, and so I have a little bit of favor there. But go ahead.
What I've seen is a confusion between content and container, and our theological systems are containers to organize the theological content in a way where we can understand it and preach it and help other people understand it. And it seems pretty predominant in Calvinism that you begin to mistake content and container to where the gospel almost becomes Calvinism. And so you take Romans 9, and all of a sudden the interlocutor is an Arminian who is saying, who are you to question God, causing people to be totally unable to receive him and believe in him, and being, only elect some and reprobate the others. And there's a confusion that happens. And I think it's important. And it was important for me when I was kind of developing what my theology was going to be, that whatever the container was actually pointed me as consistently as possible to the actual context of Scripture, and that those two things don't become confused with one another. Because as soon as the content and the container become, one thing, you run into the same problems that all the other religions are facing, where the doctrines that describe the faith of the religion are as important as the tenets of the religion itself. And I just think it's really predominant. It's one of the reasons that I just couldn't ultimately buy into Calvinism, is because it seemed like Calvinism was put in a place of priority that it didn't feel like it belonged.
Yeah, no, well, very well put. It's one of those things that once you see something like we talked about, the duck rabbit kind of analogy, once you have the systematic of the duck lenses on, you see the duck everywhere. It's kind of like after you buy that car, you see that car everywhere you go. You just you begin to read the text with those lenses on. And the reverse happens as well. I mean, I see provisionism everywhere throughout the scripture. I see, every time I read through the Bible now, I see God's provision and God's desire and love for mankind. I see it much more clearly because I read the scripture with those lenses. So we all have our lenses. Obviously, some lenses are good lenses. I think it's probably right to read a lens. I think it's probably good to come with the assumption that God is good, for example, to the scripture. I think it's probably good to come with a lens that God is desires for the salvation of all people. I think that's probably a good lens to come to the scripture with, that God always does what's right, what's just. I think that's probably a good lens to come to the scripture with. That way, when you're reading Old Testament passage or other passages that make it sound like God is doing something not good, then we can read that through the Christocentric lens of Christ and say, how could this be understood in such a way as to show that God's character is not in any way subverted or denied or misunderstood because of a hyperbolic, hyperbolic text here, or this, use of antinomy or some other, literary device that can be misunderstood as to give God blame for something that he really doesn't deserve blame for. These are the kinds of things that good hermeneutics and good apologists have to learn how to answer in order for us to rightly understand God's word. And really my goal and what I'm doing with the broadcast and the books and everything else that I've been writing is just to help people to see something that it took me 10 years to see as a Calvinist when I was one, is that there are deep, good theological containers, if you will, systematics, theological conclusions, exegetical conclusions for all of the major proof texts of Calvinism, that if seen and understood prior to adopting Calvinism, prior to putting the lenses on, in my estimation, a lot fewer people would adopt and swallow the very difficult pill of reprobation if they understood what I just explained, for example, about Romans 9 and what Paul is intending. The very reason that I focus so microscopically, if you will, on the interlocutor in Romans 9 is for the very reason you just stated, is that when you understand that the interlocutor is not an Arminian or somebody protecting synergism, and fighting against monergism or double predestination, then the entire argument and the interpretation of Romans 9 from a Calvinistic perspective just crumbles, and that veil just releases, and the duck rabbit shifts, and you go, oh, the interlocutor is not somebody opposing somebody coming up against double predestination and reprobation. The interlocutor is a Jew who thinks he's owed salvation because he's a Jew. He's a child of Abraham. And he's been running after the law. He's been striving. He's been working. He's earned this. And God's saving barbarian prostitutes, tax collectors through faith. Who are you, God? Who are you, Paul, to come in here and tell us that God is saving and showing mercy to barbarian half-breeds like Samaritans and prostitutes, and that he's passing by us? And not only is he passing by us, he's using us in our rebellion to accomplish his redemptive purpose. We're the ones who crucified him, Jews. We're the ones who cried out, crucified. We're the ones who put our own Messiah on the cross. This is the very stumbling stone that he's talking about. This is what causes them to stumble. Because in order to accept the gospel, they would have to accept the fact that they crucified their own Messiah. And how can I accept this? This is too big. This is too huge. And the interlocutor, the objector in Romans 9 is the same objector that's in Romans 3. When he says, if our unrighteousness brings out your righteousness, why are we to blame? Why, if my crying out, crucify him, was ultimately your plan, God, in order to bring the redemption through Calvary and to engraft the nations of the world so that all the nations, all the families of the earth would be blessed, i.e. your first promise to Abraham in Genesis 12. If that's really what you're doing, God, then why are you to blame me? Why are you upset with me? Why are you going to bring wrath on me if your plan was for me to cry out, crucify him, and to rebel? If you sent me the spirit of stupor, then why am I to blame? It's the same thing that Pharaoh might say. You mean you blinded me during plague number 3 or plague number 6 so as to make sure that I didn't let the people go? So why are you to blame me for not letting the people go after the second plague or the third plague if you're the one who hardened me? That's the same objection that the Israelite would be making against God of Israel. So the interlocutor in Romans 9 is not somebody opposing monergism and opposing double predestination and saying, oh, no, I can't believe that God would reprobate some people before they were ever born and that he would choose to salvifically, irresistibly save some people. I just can't accept that. And Paul is shouting them down saying, who are you to talk back to God, you Arminian? No, clearly the objector is someone objecting to the Israelite who has grown hardened and now being used by God in his hardened rebellion to bring about his redemptive purposes. And once you see that, Calvinism just doesn't have a place to go anymore. It doesn't have a place to stand because it's lost its major proof text. Because every single time you bring any objection to any of the major tenets of reprobation, what is the answer? Who are you, oh man, to talk back to God? Who are you, man, to question God? You're bringing the same objections as the interlocutor in Romans 9. No, sorry. Textually, that does not hold water. It's simply not true. That is not the interlocutor that Paul is addressing.
Well, and the conclusion of Romans 9 is all of these people that, the Jews never would have imagined to come in to the covenant family, they're doing so by faith. They're choosing to put their faith in Jesus Christ. And, while I'm going to walk a line of doing what I just said that the Calvinists do, in Romans 9, you have a group of people who have misunderstood how salvation works. And they think that there is something that you're born with, nationality on Israel's side and election on Calvinism's side, that secures your salvation. And Paul is saying that in fact is not the case, that God gets to push his plan forward however he wants to. And who are you to question how God brings people into his covenant? And to me, that's not an accusation you can level against someone who believes in libertarian free will. It actually is an accusation you can level against someone who believes in unconditional election. And so while Romans 9 is thrown in the face of people who are non-Calvinists, I actually find that while the context is obviously Israel, it is a question that could be asked of a Calvinist who doesn't think that just anyone out there can make a choice through faith to believe in Jesus, when in fact that's the very thing that Romans is trying to help us understand.
Yeah, that's a great point. And I just encourage people, if you're still on the fence, if you're still one of those who's kind of, maybe toying with Calvinism, maybe you have become a Calvinist and you're kind of hearing both sides for the first time, you're still trying to grapple through this. My goal is really to say, okay, take off the lenses long enough to see both sides objectively, to understand both sides well enough to be able to explain them to somebody who didn't know anything about Calvinism, Arminianism, or anything else. In other words, get well enough acquainted with the scholars, the best scholars from both sides, so that you're able to talk intelligently about what the other side believes. And it pains me to say this because I think that James White is typically is better at representing his opponents when he comes to the Muslim world, and maybe he is, maybe isn't. Because I don't know the Muslim world all that well. That's not my area of teaching and scholarship. So it may be that a Muslim would come along and say, no, James White's really bad at representing us too. I don't know. It seems to me, in my limited perspective, that James White actually does a lot of work to try to represent the opponents that he's coming up against in the best possible way that he can represent them, because you're only doing yourself a disservice if you represent the person that you're critiquing in a bad way. For example, if I try to make it look like John Piper was from the Westboro Baptist group or something like that, or, well, the Westboro Baptists, they hold to tulip theology, and therefore John Piper's just like they are, and then I, boogeyman them in the sense of making all Calvinists look like they're Westboro Baptist folks. Then when I destroy the Westboro Baptist Calvinists, or destroy them, you know what I mean? When I show the errors of their ways, then all people are going to do is go, well, John Piper's nothing like those guys. All you've done is made John Piper into this caricature and made him look like the Westboro Baptist guys. And so they're just not going to believe you. They're just going to walk away from you. You're actually doing yourself a disservice when you pick a really bad person to represent the other side. And so in my experience, not always the case, but in my experience, many Calvinists out there, when they're talking about Arminians, they pick the worst ones. They pick the Joel Osteens of the world, and people who are not scholars, who are not the best of the best, and then they caricature all the others to fit kind of in that category, and then they attack that group, and it makes it look like all those people look really, really bad. And if you've never done your homework, if you don't know any better, it may sound like, he's utterly destroyed everything from that perspective, when in reality he's just caricatured the group into a something that it's really not, and made it sound like it's just, stupid and dumb and gross. And the reason I even mention that too is also because sometimes people, from my perspective, I see people on my Facebook page, and maybe some of those in the chat channel now, listen, if this is you, stop doing this. Because what some of you do is some of you talk to and about Calvinists as if they're just raging lunatics that are like the Westboro Baptist folks, and that they don't really believe the Bible, that they're horrible, bad people. And when you approach them from that perspective, you discredit yourself from being heard. And they're never going to be persuaded to listen to your perspective if you don't treat them with the respect that they're due. You're never going to persuade them. And that's one of the reasons at the top of the Facebook page, I put that verse out of Proverbs that talks about how the sweetness of speech is more persuasive, because my goal is to persuade people who were like me in my 20s, who were hell-bent, set on convincing people that Calvinism was true because I really believed it was true. And guess what? I love Jesus, and I was an evangelist. I was just as much of an evangelist then as I am now. I went on mission trips as a Calvinist, and I won people to the Lord. I sat with people just like I did the other day in the Starbucks, leading somebody to Christ. I did that when I was a Calvinist too. And I genuinely love my kids. I didn't try to burn them at the stake, or I didn't, sacrifice them to idols or any of those things when I was a Calvinist. Okay. The only thing difference between those two, I have a beard now, and I didn't when I was a Calvinist, which is ironic. In other words, Calvinists are, generally speaking, now I know there's some raging weird guys online that a lot of people see as representing all Calvinists, and that's unfortunate. And just as there's raging weird non-Calvinists online too, by the way, be careful of how you address the people who disagree with you on this perspective, because when you put them in that category of just crazy or loony or mean or nasty or all those kinds of things, then it's really hard to address them with the respect that they deserve as human beings, as fellow heirs of Christ, as brothers and sisters in Christ, that in order to help them to at least open their eyes to say, maybe I should step back and reread Romans 9 with this in mind, okay? With this idea in mind, this corporate perspective and election to service and what that means, and what Paul might have been drawing out about mercying and hardening, that mercying doesn't mean to effectually save, and hardening doesn't mean to effectually damn. that maybe I need to reread the text with these things in mind. And then all of a sudden, before you know it, I get another message like I got this morning saying, hey, I know I used to debate you on the line, but I see what you're saying now, and I've left Calvinism. I get messages like that daily, weekly at least. And that happens when people are respectful enough to a Calvinist to allow them to grant them repentance, as the Timothy passage, that you're kind and you're generous so as to grant somebody the opportunity to leave their old way and to adopt a new way of seeing something that comes through gentleness and respect. It doesn't come through hatred and being angry. And I'll just encourage you, and I'm saying this to myself as much as I'm saying it to anybody else, because I have a tendency to do this too. Sometimes after you've gone so far in a debate with a Calvinist over these issues, sometimes the best thing you can do is say, hey, brother, thanks for the discussion. God bless you. Let's pick this back up later. Pray about it. Read this guy, and I'll read what you want me to read, or I'll read this book. But end on a happy note, end on a good note, showing respect to the person, and just leaving the conversation before it gets overly heated to the point where you're all you end up doing is hardening the heart of the person you're trying to persuade, because you're pushing them so far into their system that they've doubled down so many times now that they in a sense that their eyes can become closed to any other view out there, because they are so entrenched in what they believe is true. And I was there. I mean, I was there in my Calvinism, and it really wasn't until I got out of the heat of the debate and I was kind of by myself in my own studies that I began to try to drop the Calvinism, and I began to drop the lenses to be able to see it from the other perspective. And so let me just encourage you guys, as you're debating these issues and talking through them with your friends and family members, is to give space, pray, be kind, take it a bite at a time, a little bit at a time, as you see fit. I can't remember, Clayton, did you say that you had never have adopted Calvinism, or is that something that's part of your testimony? I don't know your story.
Yeah, I grew up in the church, and had a lot of the kind of application parts of Calvinism as a part of my walk with Christ. And when I actually studied theology, I was under a lot of Calvinist teaching. I wrestled with it, and it was predominantly what the people around me were accepting in large numbers, the young, restless, reformed. And I never could get on board with it. It felt like there were too many inconsistencies for me. I know you don't need this, but what you're doing is really important, and it's having a huge impact. And people need to know that it's a false dichotomy that you're either a Calvinist or an Arminian. Like, there are other really robust options out there, and options that are honoring to God and theologically robust. And my passion in life is to reach people who are far from God. At the end of Anderson's article, he asks a rhetorical question of who could say, how many Christians could say that they chose to believe the gospel? And in his mind, it's zero. Nobody can say that they actually chose that. He seemingly implies that people don't really change their minds, which I think is just pretty obviously incorrect if you observe the world around you. But our church is full of people who were just like I was at one point in my life, where I was very, very lost and very far from God, and had people who loved me and presented the gospel and were living out the gospel. And through that, the grace and just the Spirit indwelled message of the gospel, I believed, and I chose to believe. And I know I chose because I had been choosing a very, very, very wayward life for a long time. And I'm just telling you, there are people, we baptized 135 people in our church in 2019 who would tell you, I chose to believe in Jesus. They were living like hell, and they were addicted, and they were on the brink of divorce, and there were all of these things that the world gives us. And I just think, if we're so depraved that we can't choose God, I think we lose a part of the gospel message that everything in creation is groaning. We have this deep longing and deep desire for God, and we try to satisfy it with all the things in the world. And ultimately, when people see that it is only Jesus who will actually fill that desire, they come to the point of seeing themselves and their sin and seeing God as holy and putting their faith in him. And I do believe that Calvinism, people are coming to know Jesus in Calvinist churches, but I think that your theology is at the center of your philosophy of ministry, which informs your methodology of ministry. And I believe a lot of people are being kept from the gospel, and the gospel isn't being proclaimed clearly and boldly, because at the end of the day, even Anderson, a moderate Calvinist, believes that no one can choose to believe. It has to be that you were chosen first. You were chosen to believe so that you can believe. And I think it is keeping a lot of people from hearing a clear gospel message that's for them. And so I think James White doesn't take provisionalism serious. It's why he strawmans all the time, because he's not actually taking the time to understand our arguments on these different passages. He doesn't care. And my real encouragement would be to focus on evangelism, to focus on the cross. And if we do that and we present the true gospel, people are going to come to it. And one day we'll be taken seriously because of the number of lives that have been changed in churches who actually believe that Jesus died for all people and that all people can choose to put their faith in Jesus. So what you're doing is important. I think Calvinism is going to grow and grow for a little while longer, and it'll hit its breaking point, it'll die out again. And we need to keep our hand to the plow and keep our eyes on the horizon, keep doing the good work that we were put here to do, and leave the rest up to God.
Well, I can't think of a better way to end the broadcast than with that. That's a wonderful word of ministry. And I know with this website, obviously the focus is on the whole soteriological divide and the differences in our worldview. And as I point out, at least as often as I remember to, that our main goal in doing what we do is to continue to spread the good news of God's love and provision for all people. And that's the heart of evangelism. We don't want that to impact negatively our methodology in reaching others. My role as the director of evangelism for Texas Baptist really focuses on how we get the message to the lost, and how we defend that with those who are especially leaning towards atheism and agnosticism and science views, as if science is somehow opposed to Christianity. Those are the kinds of things we're trying to answer within our culture. And Calvinism, whether people recognize it or not, is playing a huge role culturally within that dynamic between the lost and the saved. And those of us who do this for a living, this is my work as an evangelist, they see it. The reason I started the broadcast, a lot of people don't realize this, I was in my 20s when I was a Calvinist, and when I was about 30-ish or so, early 30s is when I came out of Calvinism. But I didn't say anything about Calvinism until I was close to 40 publicly. I didn't write about it, didn't talk about it because it wasn't that big of a deal. I mean, it's not that big of an issue to me. I was just like, people believe that. It's kind of an angel's dance on the head of a pin, and they're wrong about this, but I think this is right. And, I got it on some message boards and was messaging about it with my theology buddies, but didn't really want to do anything public about it because, hey, it's an internal issue, just doesn't need to be addressed. It's not a big deal. But when I was working as a youth evangelism director for 13 years, and now for the last 5 or so years as the director of evangelism apologetics, I began to see how Calvinism was practically impacting the church and its approach to apologetics, as well as the impact it has on especially young people who adopt a more deterministic way of living life. Even direct examples of people who are dealing with the same things that I dealt with when I was a young Calvinist, of struggling with addictions and problems and thinking, well, it must be God determined it, or God didn't choose me, otherwise he would take away this issue. And though Calvinists wouldn't want people to draw that conclusion about their system, inevitably some people will, by God's decree, mind you, if it's true. But these kind of practical things begin to just come in front of me over and over and over again, even in my youth evangelism world. And I begin to go, you know what, this has to be addressed. There has to be some counter to this Piperism, this huge rise of MacArthurism and Sproullism and all the other isms you could attach to this rise of internet Calvinists. It was right during the middle of the 90s that the Founders Conference of the Southern Baptist Convention, that John Piper and Passion and all of that hit right at the middle of the 90s into the early 2000s. was all at the same time. And that's exactly the same time that the internet began to become popular. I remember the first time I typed in www was 1995-ish or something like that, right? Mid-90s, right when I was getting out of college. That's the same time that passion was starting, getting rolling, and all of that kind of stuff is all happening at the same time. And so you have this microcosm all coming together where Calvinists are coalescing and beginning to defend, because they feel like the minority, which back then they were distinct minorities, and they began to coalesce and to teach and to write their books and to do all their stuff. And then online hits, and then they begin to produce this massive materials online, answering the questions from a Calvinistic perspective. And so in the 90s and early 2000s, the non-Calvinists weren't talking about Calvinism. We were doing evangelism, all the other stuff that everybody else is doing, which Calvinists were doing too. I'm not saying they were neglecting those things, but we weren't talking about soteriology. We didn't think we needed to be. And so there was nothing being produced like Ligonier Ministries or Grace to You Ministries or monergism.com or calvinistcorner.com or the Got Questions or all these other behemoth websites that are out there that have theological determinism or Calvinism at the root of them. Those were all being developed while we, the non-Calvinists, I say we, I wasn't at the time, but the non-Calvinists were just doing ministry and normal Christian stuff. We weren't talking about soteriology. And so Calvinism looks like it's just this overwhelming swell of just everybody's a Calvinist. Statistically speaking, it's only about 20-30% are Calvinist in the Christian world, of those professing Christians. But that 20-30% is a very loud 20-30%. They're very serious.
They got the seminaries, even before the .com boom. It was a strategic effort to influence the seminaries on the part of the Calvinists. And so now you look at even a place like DTS, they're still dispensational. But Zane Hodges, Dave Anderson, some big proponents of the free grace movement came out of there. And now they're largely Calvinist, even though they're still dispensational. And when they got the seminaries, it really laid the groundwork for the expansion of these ideas. And it's the same thing politically. A lot of these political ideas are really still in the minority, but it doesn't seem like it because they've taken the universities. And it's a really powerful place. And so it's an uphill battle and can feel lonely. But, I'm really honored to have gotten to be on with you today. And I wanted you to know that what you're doing really does make a difference. And we'll just keep chipping away and reaching people. And it's going to be good. It's going to be fine.
Let's keep doing it, my friend. Well, thanks for joining us. I sent the link for about 5 or 6 to join, and you and Cranman were the only ones who were able to jump on, I guess. And so it ended up working out perfectly, though. That's God and his sovereignty worked it out perfectly for us. So we do believe in sovereignty, just not determinism.
Yeah, absolutely.
So, well, God bless you, Clayton. Appreciate you joining me, and appreciate those who joined in. Hopefully this broadcast has been helpful for you. We'll see you all next time. God bless.
All right.
Bye-bye.